The Lion's Mate by Mary T. Williams. A paranormal, lion shifter romance via romancely.com. Chapter 1.
Leah looked in all directions before untying her yellow robe and letting it fall off her shoulders into a pool around her feet. As she dived off the dock and was surrounded by the cool, refreshing water, the stress she'd been harboring in her mind slowly drifted away as she sliced through the water. The tense shoulders and neck released as she used long strokes to pull away from the dock. At nearly 50 feet, she stopped and tread water, looking up at the sky, pleased with what she saw. Clouds in the blue sky greeted her, and she happily floated on her back and allowed the water, the sky, and the surrounding forest to calm her. Leah had been working non-stop over the last week, rushing her creative process more than she cared to in order to meet the deadline proposed by her editor. She had yet to miss a deadline since she'd published her first novel, and now that she had published 4, she knew she had a little leeway when it came to the deadline. But that didn't mean she wanted to miss it. That would drive her insane. Her newest novel was different from the others she'd written, although all had the same characters and were set in the same world. The 5th was the final installment of the world she'd created. She had envisioned 2 different endings, but now that she'd reached the end, neither of them felt right. The character she had created had been embraced by the young adults of the shifter world, something Leah took pride in. Although she was human, she had lived around wurs her whole life and felt just as comfortable with them as she did with humans. In her mind, she composed yet another ending as she floated. A dog barking caught her attention, and she lifted her head out of the water to scan the area. Her Labrador retriever, Jenny, was sitting on the dock, waiting to be invited into the water. Leah laughed a little, then whistled quietly. The dog leaped into the water as if she'd been released from a bow, causing a huge splash. She swam straight to Leah, waited for her head to be patted by her mistress, and turned around and swam back to shore. She'd just come in to make sure Leah was not drowning. With the reassurance, Jenny walked up on the beach near the dock and flopped down in the mud to enjoy the sunshine. Leah grumbled playfully, a grin on her face. "Damn dog, now she'll need a bath." A noise across the small lake called her attention, but she could see nothing from her vantage point in the water. She wondered briefly if Annie would be willing to bathe her, but discarded the thought immediately. Although the pair got along, Annie, a shifter whose animal form was an owl, caused a skittishness in Jenny, who would slunk away and stay behind Leah. Let her enjoy herself. Leah thought to herself. She rolled back over to her back and continued floating and composing, completely relaxed, just as she needed to be in order to write brilliance. A male lion, larger than what can be found in Africa, sat at the edge of the forest, watching intently, his enhanced vision allowing perfect sight. And he was grateful for his lion eyes today. Mark, a lion shifter, smiled, his lion tongue lolling out of his mouth as he watched the human woman swimming in powerful strokes across the lake. She was made for the water, moving in it like a mermaid, beautiful and graceful. His eyes followed the pattern she made, and when her dog jumped into the water, he grinned and chortled. The dog made so much splashing noise, thank goodness, that he wasn't overheard by it or the woman. The loyal dog swam out to her mistress and waited for a pat on the head before heading to shore and dropping down in the mud. When the woman murmured to herself, he chortled again at her words. Her head turned toward his spot just inside the cover of trees. He froze, silencing his lion laugh, and waited only a few seconds before she returned to her swim. Her strokes had become lazy as she returned to the dock. She climbed up the ladder, her naked body shimmering with water in the afternoon sun. A good portion of her time was spent outside in the sun, probably nude, based on the lack of tan lines on her flawless, golden skin. Her wet hair looked brown, but he would bet it was a strawberry blonde when dry. Hints of red and gold showed on the wet strands. He was too far away to see her eyes, but he imagined they were either blue or green, hopefully green. His eyes widened as he watched her bend to retrieve her robe, and he moved forward a handful of steps to see her better. As she swung the robe onto her arms and pulled it to cover herself, she turned around. Her eyes landed on him in his lion form, and she froze. Leah stared at the lion. Her lips tightened. She wasn't stupid. That was a shifter, and he'd been watching her swim and had seen her naked. Fury pushed through her body and out her mouth. "What the hell are you doing?" she yelled across the water. She watched as the lion moved into the sun and shifted into a man. Her eyes narrowed. "You son of a bitch." She whirled around to get to her house. Jenny, meanwhile, had taken notice of the man and set to barking like a rabid dog. But she didn't move toward the man. "Wait," Mark called to her. He hurried around the lake. "Please wait. Let me explain." Leah halted and jerked around to face him. Jenny stood just behind her, hackles up and growling menacingly. Her eyes returned to the lean form hurrying toward her in all his naked glory. His hair was the color of a lion's mane and just as untamed. Golden eyes looked back at her surrounded by dark lashes. His features were strong and chiseled, handsome and wonderful to look at. Leah glared at him, remembering herself and his invasion of her privacy and her property. "Explain what, you pervert? That you were watching me swim and saw me naked? This is private property." Mark's hands were up in a defensive position. Whoa, I messed up, but I'm standing naked in front of you right now. Aren't we even?" he asked with a mischievous grin. Leah's eyes, of their own volition, dropped to his cock, large and impressive even while flaccid. She jerked them back up to his and lifted an eyebrow at him. "That does not make us even. I did not choose to be naked in front of you." Mark chuckled but smothered it quickly. Her eyes were green like the leaves of the trees around them. "I didn't choose to be naked in front of you either. Just happens when I shift back." Leah rolled her eyes and groaned. "Oh, good Lord." Exasperated, she mumbled, "Shifters and their senses of humor." Mark's eyes lit up. "So you have friends who are shifters then?" "Of course I do. But they don't sneak up on someone when she is naked and enjoying a relaxing swim." "Back to that." Mark nodded, the humor in his eyes clear. "Listen, I was just letting some steam off by exploring the forest. I didn't even know there was a lake here. I just happened to stumble on it, and there you were. On my own property. This lake falls inside my fence line, which means you must have crossed it at some point. There was no fence in the forest." Leah cursed silently. He was right. She hadn't wanted a fence built in the middle of the forest. The animals needed freedom to move about as they wished, and she wouldn't hinder that with a fence. "Regardless, you are trespassing." Mark roared with laughter but sobered quickly. "You're right. I'm sorry. I was really just passing by." He looked around. Her cabin sat back in the trees, hidden from any roads that might be nearby. The driveway curved around and headed away through the forest, and a small truck sat in it. Her porch faced the water, and he would bet the view of the sun setting over the lake was just about the most beautiful sight in the world. "Your place is great." His compliment took her off guard. She was still angry but couldn't be as she followed his gaze to her home. "Thank you." She turned back to him, a smirk on her face. "I've lived here 3 years, and you're the first person to trespass." Mark shook his head at her, amusement in his eyes. "You're a touch broad to crack, I see. I'll just have to turn on the charm." Leah snorted. "Broad? Are you from the 1920s? You almost smiled that time." "I must be doing something right," Mark said. Leah couldn't help it. She grinned at him, then giggled when he threw his arms up in the air in triumph. "Don't be so damn proud of yourself. I'm laughing because this situation is just absurd." "Absurd? Why?" Mark asked, leaning in a little closer. "I've met a beautiful woman and am flirting with her. Why is that absurd?" "You're naked," she pointed out. Mark looked down at himself, up at her with a sexy smile and said, "See anything you like?" "Oh, good Lord," Leah said, her eyes nearly rolling out of her head. "Are you always so arrogant?" "I prefer to call it confidence." "Semantics. You use one because it doesn't sound as negative as the other." "Aha! She's a smart one," Mark exclaimed with a wink at her. "I like smart women." Leah laughed at him, charmed in spite of herself. "I bet you do." She finally let her curiosity take the lead. "Where did you come from, exactly?" There aren't any houses nearby. Actually, there's a cabin on the other side of the forest. I'm renting it for the next 2 months. Leah mused. That cabin is almost 3 miles away. The forest is extensive. How did you not get lost? I'm a shifter. We don't get lost. Leah shook her head, chuckling. There's that arrogance again. Mark lifted a finger as if schooling her. Confidence, beautiful. Confidence. Sure. So, am I forgiven for my indiscretion earlier? He gave her a winning smile. Leah pretended to consider for a minute, then conceded. I'll make you a deal. I swim every evening when it's warm around this time, usually for about an hour or so. Naked. Mark wiggled his eyebrows lasciviously. Leah stared at him, her lips pursed in irritation. He lifted his hands in defense again. Sorry. Please go on. She pointed a finger at his chest. I honestly don't mind if you run through my property as long as you stay away at this time of the day. And as long as you don't kill any of the animals. Mark pretended to be affronted, his hand on his chest mockingly. I would never harm another creature, whatever carnivore. Just don't do your hunting on my land, Leah ordered. Yes, ma'am. Mark saluted her, which elicited another giggle from Leah. Can I ask you one question? Leah's look was suspicious, but she nodded. Yes. Can I come to the lake and watch you swim if you invite me? Leah's laugh echoed. She threw her head back, and Mark's eyes watched as her chest heaved from the laughter. When she looked at him again, eyes filled with mirth, he was struck by her. He smiled. So, can I? Leah shook her head. If I invite you to watch me swim, you won't just watch me. You'll join me, she teased. I like the sound of that, human, Mark said with a grin. He glanced over his shoulder. The sun was low in the sky, and just as he'd assumed, the view was breathtaking. Magnificent. Leah smiled as she looked at the horizon. Yes, that's why I chose this place. I would have paid double for it. I can imagine. They watched the sun set for a few silent moments. Then he shook himself and returned his attention to her. I'd better be going. I said I don't get lost, but I'm not familiar with these woods yet. A trip in the dark may be treacherous for such a delicate being as myself. There is absolutely nothing delicate about you, especially not your ego. Mark put his hand over his heart. You slay me with your words, lovely lady. Whatever. Mark laughed. Good night. Before she could blink, he had shifted into his lion form. She gasped at his majestic form as he prowled in front of her, his head high. Jenny growled quietly behind her, and Leah put a hand on her head to calm her. Mark sniffed at the dog and made a small sound that resembled the noise a puppy might make. Jenny's ears perked up, and she tilted her head back and forth as he continued to make the noise. When Mark moved closer, Jenny loped over to him and they began to wrestle. Leah watched, her eyes wide in surprise. Jenny didn't like shifters, had never liked them. She didn't even like Annie, who lived with them all the time. But this man, a lion shifter nonetheless, had charmed his way into her dog's heart. A small part of her heart beat just a little harder as she watched, and she shook her head, reminding herself that she didn't need someone like him in her life, no matter how charming he was or how much her dog liked him. She snapped her fingers and called to Jenny, who disengaged from her new friend and ran to her mistress, a doggy grin on her face. Good night, lion man, Leah said. He rose from where he'd been wrestling with Jenny and sauntered close to her. Like a giant house cat, he rubbed his entire body over her legs, winding around her and letting his tail curl around her thighs. Leah laughed and gave his mane a little tug. Stop trying to be adorable and get out of here. Mark looked at her, his eyes beautiful in the lion's face. He tilted his head, his mane flowing, and pushed at her with a giant paw. When she only stared at him, he nudged her with his head. She sighed and began petting his head as if her were a house cat. He didn't purr, lions can't, but he made a strange, deep humming noise to indicate his happiness. Leah grumbled, Fine, you big ol' kitten. If you want to come by again one day this week you can. But not while I'm swimming. She accompanied this warning with a tug on one of his ears. Mark let out a roar of happiness and stood up on his hind feet. He put his front paws on her shoulders, nearly toppling her, and licked her cheek. He dropped back to all fours, batted her with his tail, and sprinted around the lake and into the forest. Leah laughed as she watched his quick progress, marveling at his speed. She shook her head, also marveling at his ability to charm her right into an invite to stop by again. She walked with Jenny to the house, frowning. She was not usually so easily won over by a stranger, especially by a stranger who had been watching her without her knowledge. As she mounted the steps, her thoughts remained on him, and would return to him throughout the evening as she worked on the end of her novel. Mark's thoughts were on her as well, as he meandered through the forest, in no hurry to reach his lonely cabin. He realized he'd forgotten to ask for her name, nor had he supplied her with his. But she'd invited him back one day this week, and he was concocting a plan. He wanted to swim with her, plain and simple. She was stunningly beautiful, flirtatious, obviously intelligent, and, he would bet, a ton of fun once they got to know each other. His plan was to arrive at her house tomorrow evening just before she went for her swim. He'd charm his way into that lake, even if he had to bargain and bring a suit along with him. A rabbit darted out in front of him, afraid of the strange predator lurking in the forest. Instinctively, his body poised to spring after it, to enjoy the chase, but he remembered his promise. He would not hunt on her land. He looked around. He was almost to the edge of the forest closest to the cabin he'd rented. Surely he was no longer on her land. The lion in him lowered its head, growled quietly, and sprang after the helpless hare. Annie walked in from work an hour later and yelled out for her. Leah answered from her office, and Annie walked in carrying the mail. "Your editor sent you a card," she said, dropping the mail on the desk and her body onto the comfortable leather couch Leah had bought for her office for when she needed a break. "Really?" Leah picked it up. After reading, she scoffed, "Just a friendly reminder of my due date. After making that damn publisher so much money, you would think she'd be a little more patient," Annie claimed. She knew how hard Leah had been working on the ending of this book. It irked her that the editor was so impatient. Well, she's just doing her job," Leah offered, returning to her computer. She looked at it briefly and closed the laptop with a frown on her face. She hadn't been able to concentrate. Her thoughts kept returning to the gorgeous lion man who had visited her earlier in the day. She glanced at Annie, who was chewing her nails. "Why are you chewing your nails?" "I'm nervous, Leah. We're meeting with that lawyer tomorrow," Annie said, her voice almost a whine. Leah chose to ignore the teenager's whine. "I'll be with you the whole time. Don't worry. I'm trying. But it's such a big deal, don't you think?" "It is. You're doing the right thing, Annie. Shifters deserve the same treatment, the same rights as humans," Leah returned. "I know. I'm just scared." "No need for fear, I promise. You are my best friend's sister, and you have her strength in you," Leah reassured her. "And I'll be right next to you the whole time, no matter what happens." Annie smiled. "Thanks, Leah. Want me to cook dinner tonight? Let's cook together. Sound good?" She rose and smiled at her. "Come on. I'm done working for the night. Let's make dinner and eat." After dinner and more reassurance, Annie went upstairs to study. She had opted for online courses this semester, although she'd wanted the experience every high school graduate wanted: dorm life, college life. But the college she'd applied to, Glenrose University, which was in the small town closest to their house and shared the same name, had declined her application once they discovered she was a shifter, which was a violation of the Shifter Rights Act. Leah had immediately contacted a lawyer, who they would be meeting with the next morning in town to discuss the case. Although Leah would never admit it, she was nervous too. Annie no longer wanted to attend the university. She was suing the school simply because what they were doing was wrong, and Leah had encouraged her in the endeavor. But Leah knew things could get ugly, and she promised herself as she washed her face that she'd do her best to protect Annie from the ugliest parts if she could. She crawled into bed, her mind on the meeting tomorrow. Her thoughts shifted to her novel and the incomplete end. And just before she drifted off to sleep, Mark popped into her brain, and she smiled to herself as consciousness faded. If you want more paranormal romances like this, please, my love, be sure to subscribe to the Romancely YouTube channel. I look forward to spending more time with you. Subscribe and let's make it happen.
Chapter 2. Rise and Shine, Annie Bell. Leah called from the kitchen, using the nickname she'd given Annie years ago. She'd been up since dawn, her sleep plagued by golden eyes, wild hair, and a body that made her drool. Her comforter and sheets had been a tangled mess when she'd finally decided to get up. Sleep had been defeated by desire, something she was unaccustomed to. She'd made coffee, only since they were meeting the lawyer at the cafe in town for breakfast. Her nerves were taut from lack of sleep and anxiety. The lawyer she'd hired was the best shifter rights lawyer in the state. She'd read about several cases he'd won, a few that had caused quite the tempest in whatever town he'd been in. But she knew fighting this battle was the right thing to do. Shifters should have the same rights as humans, after all. Annie bounded down the steps, already showered and dressed for the day. Leah smiled at her. "Good morning. Sleep well?" "Not at first. Around 2 I stepped outside for a quick flight over the forest. I just had too much energy. But after that I slept fine." Annie, as an owl shifter, often woke in the middle of the night and desired naps during the day. The owl part of her affected her even when she was in her human form, something Leah often teased her about when she yawned hugely at 10 in the morning. "Good." She handed Annie a cup of coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of milk. Leah had finished hers and was going about the business of feeding the dog and putting fresh birdseed out in the handful of bird feeders she had hung on her back porch. Jenny followed Leah as she worked, and a pair of songbirds landed on the railing of the porch, waiting patiently for her to move away so they could eat their breakfast. Jenny never ate until Leah had finished feeding the birds. Her doggy manners dictated that she wait for everyone to have their food. Besides, she needed some outside time to relieve herself before she ate. Annie glanced down at Jenny as she ate, a grimace on her face. "She is the loudest eater I've ever heard in my life." "Well, hurry up, then, and we'll leave." "Then you don't have to hear her," Leah commented. She turned to hurry back to her room. "Wait. I haven't put on any makeup this morning." "I'll hurry." "You're putting makeup on for this?" Annie called. She followed her into the master bedroom bathroom and watched her brushing mascara over her lashes, her coffee forgotten on the kitchen counter. "You never wear makeup." "Sometimes the occasion calls for a little mascara," Leah told her, glancing briefly in her direction before adding just a touch of lip gloss. "Lip gloss too? Geez, are we meeting the president?" Annie teased, then laughed loudly when Leah stuck her tongue out at her. She looked at her reflection and mused, "Should I touch up my makeup?" Leah rolled her eyes. Annie wore makeup every day, although she chose the minimal look. One could never tell for sure if she was wearing any, which was exactly her plan. "Didn't you just put it on?" Leah asked. Annie turned her head from side to side. "Yes, but if you're putting on mascara, I may need more than my usual touches." Leah groaned. "You're fine, miss. I'm 18 with flawless skin." "Like you're so old." "Miss, I'm a famous writer and I am only 27. "Shut up." "Whatever." Leah rolled her eyes again. "It's like we're sisters or something." Annie laughed and put her arm around Leah as they walked back through the house to the kitchen. "That's right. Maybe not by blood, but just as close." Leah nudged her arm off. "You're such a dork. Where are my keys?" "To the Jeep or the car?" "Jeep. I think we'll want a little wind in our hair on the way home after this meeting." "On the peg by the door," Annie said, pointing. "Let's go then." Leah whistled to Jenny and put her in the sunroom, where she stayed when no one was home. She checked her water supply, locked the door behind her, and followed Annie to the Jeep. The drive to town was almost 20 minutes, which was exactly why Leah had chosen the house she had. She didn't want to live in town with nosy neighbors, she preferred her privacy out in the country. She did admire the little town they'd chosen. Glenrose was a quaint little college town, small enough that gossip was still the main form of entertainment. During the school year, the population doubled, but the town was still quiet and filled with families who preferred the small-town atmosphere. Leah, who was from a different state, had chosen this place after she'd become a little more famous for her novels than she liked. People here didn't care that she was a famous author. In fact, she was pretty sure most of them had no idea who she was. The college kids knew, though, and she'd been invited to speak a handful of times, all of which she declined. And now, she was helping her friend sue the college for discrimination. "I'll never be invited again," she had mused when she'd thought of it. Parking the Jeep was tricky in the tiny lot next to the Glenrose Cafe. This was a favorite spot among the older crowd in Glenrose, and for good reason. The food here was spectacular and the atmosphere cozy. Leah always felt as if she were back in her grandmother's kitchen, eating a stack of pancakes with her parents. Nostalgia was not her favorite emotion, but the occasional stab was all right, and this place made her wish for her childhood. She ate there every time she drove into town for whatever reason, treating herself to good food and happy thoughts. Annie held onto a manila folder as if it were a life-saving buoy and she were floundering in the ocean. Leah touched her hand before they climbed out of the Jeep. "Listen. This is the easy part. We'll talk to this lawyer, show him the documents, and see what he says. If you aren't comfortable pursuing this, we'll drop it. If you are, I'll stand by you the whole time, no matter what." Annie smiled, grateful. She released the folder and entwined her fingers in Leah's. "What would I do without you?" "Thank you, Leah. As you said when you were being all weird this morning. You're the closest thing I have to a sister. We have to stick together." Annie took a deep breath, checked her reflection in the mirror on the sun visor, squared her shoulders, and said, "Let's do this." Leah laughed at her go-getter attitude. "A big stack of pancakes or an omelet will settle those nerves." "Food always does," Annie agreed as they walked to the door of the cafe. "It's a wonder I'm not 300 pounds. "Same here," Leah commented as they entered. She looked around, wondering if the lawyer was here yet. She knew his name but had no idea what he looked like. As her eyes roamed the room, they landed on the lion shifter. Leah gasped as their eyes met. His grin was huge as he rose to greet them. "What a pleasure," he said by way of greeting them. "The beautiful swimmer." "The charming lion," Leah said, light sarcasm in her tone. "And who is this lovely young woman?" Mark asked, smiling at Annie. Annie looked sideways at Leah, curiosity driving her mad. She put her hand out to shake his and introduced herself. "I am Annie Daniels." Mark's eyes widened in surprise, and he threw his head back to laugh, drawing the eyes of several customers. "Are you really?" He looked at Leah. "And you must be Leah Green." Leah raised an eyebrow. "How do you know that?" She stopped herself. "Oh, good Lord, you're the lawyer." Mark chuckled again. "That I am, Ms. Green. Mark Anderson, at your service." He executed a small bow, and Leah rolled her eyes at him. "Do you know each other?" Annie asked, grinning. Leah glanced at her. "He interrupted my swim yesterday, but we didn't exchange names." "That's hilarious." "If you say so," Leah said. Mark still wore the grin on his face. "Come on, ladies. I have a table right back here." He led them to the last table along the window and pulled their chairs out for them. The waitress hurried over, her eyes on Mark although she spoke to Leah and Annie. "Good morning, ladies. What can I get you to drink?" "Unsweet iced tea for me, and a menu, please," Annie asked. "Same," Leah pronounced, her eyes on Mark. After the waitress walked away, she said, "So, you're not only a shifter rights lawyer, you're a shifter." "Why do you think I care so much about shifter rights?" he asked with a gleam in his eye. "It's my passion." "That's great. Probably why you win so many cases," Annie said, smiling at the handsome man across from them. "You are correct, Ms. Daniels," Mark affirmed. "Please call me Annie." "And I'm Mark." They looked at Leah, who nodded. The waitress returned with their drinks and took their orders for breakfast. After she walked away, a lingering eye on Mark, he leaned back in the booth and put his arm across the back. "So, you two aren't related, correct?" "How do you know each other?" Mark asked. Leah gestured for Annie to tell the story. "My parents and sister were killed in a plane crash 5 years ago. Leah and my sister, Amy, were best friends all through school. I had no other family, so Leah asked me to come here and live with her. So I've lived with her almost 5 years now." Mark looked at Leah. "You must have been very young to take on that kind of responsibility." Leah nodded. "I was 22. But I'd already published my first novel, which was successful, thank goodness. She would have gone into foster care had I not taken her in." "So her parents hadn't made plans for her in case they died?" Actually, I was supposed to live with my sister, but she died too," Annie answered. "I didn't want to live in an orphanage or foster care. Luckily, I had Leah, who was willing to take me in." "Did you officially adopt her?" "I did, although we chose not to change her name to mine." Mark nodded. "That's good. Of course, now she's a legal adult, so her past shouldn't matter." "Why would it matter?" Leah asked, suspicious. Mark leaned forward and put his elbows on the table. In these types of cases, the lawyers dig into the past lives of the complainant. Annie has nothing to hide. "She's never done anything she shouldn't," Leah defended. "Of course not, but that doesn't mean they won't look," Mark said, looking at Annie. "Why don't you tell me what happened when you contested the denial of acceptance?" Annie opened her mouth to answer, but the waitress arrived with their food. She placed their plates in front of them and asked if they needed anything, then left after negative replies. "Let's eat. Then we'll get down to business," Mark suggested. The women nodded, and they tucked into a delicious breakfast. A bit later, Mark sat back, rubbing his stomach. "Oh my God, I think my stomach might bust." "This is the best place to eat in Glenrose," Leah commented, wiping syrup off her mouth before gulping the last of her milk. "Annie, are you ready to get back to business?" Mark asked with a smile. Annie cleared her throat and signaled the waitress for a refill, then nodded her head. "Sure. What do you want to know?" "Let's go back to my question. Tell me what happened when you spoke to the dean after you received your letter denying acceptance?" Annie looked at Leah, who nodded encouragingly. "Well, I called and made an appointment with the dean when I received the letter. I was valedictorian, for God's sake. I wasn't attempting to enter an Ivy League school, just the local college." Mark laughed. "I understand. I've looked up the requirements to gain admission into Glenrose University, and you well surpassed them." Annie pointed her finger at him. "Exactly. That's why I wanted to meet with the dean and find out what the problem was." "And he agreed to meet you?" "Yes. I asked him why I had been denied admittance, and he told me I couldn't go to his college because I wasn't human. Were those his exact words? Mark asked, his eyes intent on her. Yes. After the meeting, I wrote down everything I could remember because I knew I would forget. She looked at Leah, a small smile on her face. I cried as I wrote because I was so mad. Leah patted her hand in support. Do you have a copy of that with you? Of course. Annie handed him the manila envelope. The conversation transcript is in there as well as the letter denying my access. Mark glanced through the conversation, his frown deepening as he read. He looked up abruptly. He actually said that because you are a shifter that you wouldn't be able to keep up with the course load? Annie growled a little. Yes. I nearly shifted and ripped his eyes out. Mark laughed. I'm glad you didn't. What kind of shifter are you, anyway? Owl. Nice, Mark complimented. He continued reading until he reached the end of the page. And he also had the nerve to tell you to go to the shifter college in the next town? Is there such a thing? He did say that, Annie answered with a shrug. He's referring to the community college in Jackson, Leah told him. It's a good college, but he is accurate when he calls it a shifter school. Most of the students there are shifters. Not all, but most. Mark nodded his understanding. All right, here's the thing. You have a case here, although the conversation isn't really proof that the college refused you because of your shifter status. Too bad you didn't record it. I almost did, on my phone, but I felt that was an invasion of privacy, Annie said. I was kidding, Mark said with a smile. It would be inadmissible. Leah spoke up. So what are the chances here? I'm going to do some research, visit the campus, and see what's what, Mark told them. Right now, we have no real proof except your word that they refused you based on you being a shifter. However, like I said, I'm going to do some digging. Okay. That sounds good, Annie said. Let me ask you this. Do you want to attend this college should we pursue the case and win? Not particularly, no. I'm taking online courses now, and I plan to transfer to the state university in the spring or fall. So what are you looking to get out of this? I want other shifters to have the right to attend Glenrose University should they choose to. You don't want a settlement? Annie looked offended. I most certainly do not. I don't want their money. Mark lifted his hands in a defensive gesture. Okay. I had to ask. She doesn't need the money, Mark, Leah inserted. Her parents left her a trust fund that she now has access to. All right. Let's do this, then. I want to do my research and stuff. Give me a week and we'll meet again to discuss whether or not you have a leg to stand on here. Annie nodded. That sounds good to me. Leah? Leah shrugged. Annie, this is your decision. I'll stand by whatever you choose. Annie looked at Mark. Let's see what you find out. Great. As they were leaving the cafe, a group of girls called out to Annie. She excused herself and joined her friends. Leah watched her to make sure she'd moved out of earshot, then turned back to Mark. Mark, please tell me this isn't going to blow up in her face. She's not fragile by any means, but she can be sensitive. Mark nodded his understanding. I can't tell you that if she chooses to pursue this it won't be difficult. People here who accept her right now might be angry that she's causing an uproar. I understand that, and she does too. I'm asking if this will be a case that's all over the news. She doesn't want that. Mark considered for a moment. Honestly, I don't think so. I have a feeling the dean will settle and let shifters in rather than bring that kind of negative attention to the school. Okay, Leah murmured, concern on her face. Mark touched her shoulder gently. I won't put Annie in a position she can't handle. If she tells me to back off, I will. End of story. Leah smiled at him. Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it. He winked at her and changed the subject. So, yesterday you said I could come by in the evenings as long as I didn't interrupt swim time. Does that offer still stand? Leah laughed and shook her head. Isn't that a conflict of interest? She teased. You aren't my client, Annie is. No conflict, only interest, Mark said, his eyebrows wiggling. Leah laughed even louder at his play on words. Please come over. Why don't you bring your swim trunks and we can swim together? Mark smiled. I'd love that. What time? Around sunset. Perfect. I'll be there. As Mark walked to his car, Annie returned to Leah's side. Hey, the girls are going to a movie and staying at Janet's. I'm going to join them. You need a ride? Actually, I'm going to ride home with you and get a few things. I'll drive myself back in a couple of hours. Sounds good, Leah said as they headed for the Jeep. What were you and Mark talking about after I walked off? He's coming over for a swim, Leah mumbled under breath. Pardon me? Annie asked with raised eyebrows. Did you say he's coming over for a swim? Leah sighed. It's not a big deal, Annie. It's a huge deal. You just met him. Leah dug in her bag for her keys as she answered. Actually, we met last night. He showed up while I was swimming. I didn't know he was the lawyer, though. Annie's grin was huge as they climbed into the Jeep and Leah started it. This is so exciting. You haven't been on a date in forever. It's not a date, Annie. We're just going swimming, Leah assured her. Whatever. You invited him over. You like him. Oh, good Lord. I'm not feeding him or anything. I'm just going swimming with him, Leah said. Annie sat back in her seat, giggling quietly. How lucky for you. What do you mean by that? Well, I'll be gone all night. You'll have the whole house to yourself. You know, Annie smirked, just in case. Whatever. Annie was quiet for a few minutes, then piped up, so what are you going to wear? A bathing suit. Which one? Does it matter? Annie gasped. Of course it does. It's your first date with him. It's not a damn date. Okay, my apologies for assuming this was a date, Annie sarcastically replied. Now, which bathing suit? I don't know, Leah huffed as she took the turn that led to their home. Probably the black one. No. Annie actually shuddered in disgust. What? Why? It's the only one I have. You are going to wear one of my bikinis. And no arguments, Annie exclaimed as they drove down the long driveway. She pointed a finger at Leah. This might not be a date, as you claim, but you need to look good. Fine. But I get to pick which one, Leah argued. She wouldn't admit it, but the idea of the bikini was appealing. She had decided that she did want to look sexy for the lion shifter. But she wasn't going to tell Annie that. What time is he coming? Annie asked. Around sunset. Perfect. You'll have plenty of time to groom. You can't wear a bikini without grooming, which I bet you never do. Annie chuckled at Leah's offended look. Annie! My grooming habits are none of your business. Leah jerked the Jeep to a stop. And I do groom, for your information. We'll see. What do you mean, we'll see? You're not looking at my area. I don't want to look at your area. Gross. Annie shook her head as they climbed out and headed for the steps. Jenny was barking gleefully. I'm going to get the bikinis and you're going to try them on. Then you'll see what I mean by you have to groom. Leah rolled her eyes. She opened the door, greeted Jenny, and followed her back outside so she could do her business. If your bikinis show too much, I'm not wearing one. Annie rolled her eyes and slapped Leah's ass, making her jump. Leah, you swim every day, walk Jenny all over the place, and occasionally go for runs. You've got a body to die for. Flaunt it for this very handsome man who wants to spend time with you. Leah stared at her friend, a smile slowly appearing on her face. Okay. You're right. I never flaunt anything. Go get them and meet me in my room in 5. Annie ran off, yelling, woohoo!
Chapter 3. Leah waited on her back porch swing, moving gently forward and back, a glass of chilled red wine in her hand. Between the breakfast meeting with Mark and this point in the day, she'd managed to finish her novel. She'd finally settled on an ending, although when she'd emailed the final version to her publisher, a note had been attached to pay close attention to the end in case it needed specific changes. The stress that had built up in her body had eased tremendously, but as she pushed herself back and forth, new stress entered her mind. The case Mark was planning to build against the university weighed on her. Not because she thought they'd lose, but because of the backlash against Annie. No decision had been 100% made. He had research and interviews to conduct before he even knew if they had a case. But she felt it in her bones that Annie had been discriminated against. Mark would see it, would find proof, she was sure of it. And then Annie would have a decision to make. Did she want to pursue a court case against the university for discrimination? Leah hated the idea of discrimination of any kind. She had been raised by her mother, who had believed wholly in the rights of all people, regardless of special powers or needs. Leah often included those beliefs in her novels, inferring that all people were the same. She wanted equal rights, but not if it meant pain for Annie. She suffered enough, Leah thought as she sipped her wine. She heard her best friend's voice in her head. But she's strong too, Leah. Don't discourage her. A tear slipped out of the corner of her eye. She wiped it away gently and took another sip as memories filled her mind. The sun was close to the horizon, and Leah had filled her glass twice. The sound of galloping feet reached her ears, and she smiled when a golden lion streaked out of the forest and rounded the lake. Jenny lurched to her feet and growled briefly, but when she realized her new friend was here, she ran to greet him. Leah narrowed her eyes. Had Mark brought a suit? He obviously wasn't wearing one. Her eyebrow arched, and she thought to herself that he'd better not think they were skinny dipping. After a brief tussle with Jenny, Mark ambled slowly over to Leah and shifted abruptly in front of her, rising to his full height of 6 feet and a couple or 3 inches. Leah stepped back at the suddenness, then recovered and smirked at him. Well, hello, she said. Where's your suit? Mark smiled at her, his eyes playful and fun. He looked behind him at the spot where he and Jenny had wrestled. A bright red bag lay on the ground. He looked back at her. Do I really have to wear a suit? You've seen me naked. He held up 2 fingers and winked at her. Twice now. Leah didn't want to laugh at his charming behavior, but she couldn't help herself. She giggled prettily and playfully batted at his chest. The wine was doing its work. She felt positively giddy. Yes, you have to wear a suit. I do not swim naked with a man on the first date. Date? Mark laughed as he walked back to retrieve his bag. Leah's eyes moved briefly to his sculpted ass as he spoke. Are we on a date? Leah narrowed her eyes. You're right. This is not a date. I agree. Our first date will be something much fancier. He wiggled his eyebrows at her. And we'll be wearing clothes that cover all of our bodies. He made a point of looking down at her robe. Leah followed his eyes. Her robe had gaped in the front when she'd risen from the swing to greet him. Her breasts, though covered by the bikini, were bared to him. And the bikini didn't cover much. Leah looked back up and met his eyes, a challenge in hers. She untied the robe, her eyes never leaving his. She let the robe fall on the step behind her. He watched her movements, nearly drooling as she revealed a perfectly tanned, perfectly toned body. A giggle escaped her mouth. "Mark," she said huskily, "you seem to have lost your voice. Are you having an aneurysm or something?" He choked a little before answering her. No. Wow. You're beautiful. Thank you. Now get your suit on. I want to go swimming." Leah walked past him, swinging her hips as she walked to the dock. Mark watched her perfect ass in that tiny red bikini. He swiftly grabbed his trunks and yanked them on, not only because she'd asked him to, but because he was sporting a hard-on he wouldn't be able to disguise. When she reached the edge of the dock, she looked back at him questioningly, turned back, and executed a lovely dive, slicing into the water like she belonged in it. He raced to the dock but stopped and waited for her to resurface. "That was an impressive dive," he called when she returned to the surface and looked at him. "Swimming is the only exercise I get. I hate getting sweaty," she replied. Mark grinned. "You just haven't been the right kind of sweaty." Leah shook her head as she tread water, grinning right back at him. "I guess not. Are you getting in? Or are you going to watch me like last time, you perv?" she goaded. Mark took several steps back, ran to the edge of the dock, and leapt as far away from it as he could. Leah marveled at the bunched muscles in his legs and stomach as he moved. She didn't have long to appreciate his body. The cannonball he executed doused her face with a cascade of water that she had to cough up. When he resurfaced, she splashed his face. "Butthead. Butthead?" he asked, pretending to be stung by her name-calling. "I can't dive as well as you and wasn't going to try. A cannonball is the next best thing." "No. The next best thing is just jumping in, not trying to drown your new friend," Leah told him haughtily. "Is that right?" He swam close to her, and Leah looked at him sideways, trying to figure out what he was planning. However, he only tread water about 3 feet from her. Occasionally, her foot would brush his. Leah didn't know where to look. He watched her closely, as if she were fascinating, and she had trouble maintaining eye contact when they weren't bantering back and forth. "Why do you stare?" she finally asked when they'd been silent for the better part of a minute. "My apologies," Mark answered. "Why are you uncomfortable with the attention?" "I didn't say I was," Leah claimed. He waited in silence. Leah rolled her eyes. "Okay, fine. I'm not used to people watching me so intently. I don't like people much and prefer solitude. You're only the third person I've had here besides Annie." Mark was astonished. "Really? I would never have guessed that. You seem amiable, you aren't shy. Do you just choose to be secluded?" "Yep." Leah swam to the dock, and Mark followed close behind her. They each grabbed a side of the ladder so they could talk without exerting themselves. "Is it because you're a writer?" he asked. Leah tilted her head to the side. I never really thought about it, honestly. But I do like the worlds I create to the world I actually live in, so that could be it." "I've never read your books," he admitted sheepishly. Leah smiled and shook her head. "You're not really the demographic I'm trying to reach." He brow creased. "Aren't your books about shifters? Maybe one specific shifter? Who's your audience if not a shifter?" "Yes, it's about shifters, and many shifters do like my books. But they're mostly female and 15. "Ah, I see. Young adult books, then," he mused. "I should still read them. I heard a rumor there were talks of making them into movies." "Big stretch," she said. "I've had a couple of producers approach me, and one talked to my publisher about buying the rights. But I own the rights, and only I can make the decision." "And you don't want the books made into movies?" "Kind of, but maybe not. They might ruin my characters by choosing the wrong actors," she whispered conspiratorially, a sly grin on her face. "I'm actually starting the screenplay tomorrow for the first book, just to see. Mark watched her face and the way it lit up when she talked about her books. He couldn't help himself. He leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers gently. He didn't force it, just let his lips linger on hers, hoping she'd respond the way he wanted her to.
Oh no, it's about to get hot.
But we can't put this on YouTube as they don't allow it. I'm sorry.
But check the description of this video to join Romancely Audio Velvet and get the steamy scenes in future.
If you're already a member, the love scene reference is Baby for the Lion, Chapter 3, Love Scene 1.
Okay, back to the story.
You monster, she cried. You love it. He answered as he tossed her onto the bed and leapt on top of her, his mouth perfectly aligning with hers and effectively cutting off her word.
Chapter 4. As they dressed after round 2, Mark couldn't keep the smile off his face. Leah was perfect, perfectly beautiful, perfectly intelligent, and perfectly dirty. She interrupted his thoughts, asking if he'd like a coffee to go, and he nodded. She blew him a kiss as she walked out in a blue robe. He wondered briefly how many robes she owned, a smirk on his face. Mark felt as if he'd found his match. It happened that way with shifters sometimes. They met someone and that was it, that person was his or her soul mate. No questions, no doubts in the mind of the shifter. If two shifters met, the feeling was usually mutual, but with a human it was different. Humans moved more slowly in everything they did. They were not impulsive, had to think everything through. Mark could tell that Leah liked him and liked him a lot, but his feelings, in just a couple of days, were more than that. She was his soul mate, he was sure of it. But he couldn't tell her that yet. She was human, for one, and for another, she made decisions with logic, not with emotion. I'll have to take my time with her, woo her, Mark mused as he finished his bathroom business. He hurried downstairs in his swim trunks. He found her in the kitchen. He wrapped his arms around her. I've got to go, babe. I have a meeting with the dean and can't really show up in my trunks and shirtless. But it's so sexy, she murmured, forgetting the coffee and turning in his arms to wrap hers around his neck. You'd win him over for sure. Mark chuckled and kissed her. Thank you for making the coffee, but I have to shift to get back. Leah nodded. Totally forgot that. No worries. I'll certainly drink it after the exertion of last night. Let me take you out tonight, he asked. Like on a date, she teased. Like on a date. Unless you intend to use me only for your sexual needs, he smirked. Which, by the way, I am totally fine with. Leah laughed and pulled his mouth against hers. She broke the kiss before it could get too heated, though. I'll let you take me out, then I'll use you for sex. Fair? Perfectly fair. He kissed her again and turned to go. Pick you up at 8? Sounds good, she called as he walked out the door. She watched as he shifted and played with Jenny for a moment, and she could feel the ridiculous smile on her face. Jenny followed him for a moment, then turned back and came to the door to be let in, a goofy dog smile. Leah shook her head as she let Jenny in. I guess he makes us both giddy. Mark hurried through his morning routine, choosing his gray suit, crisp, white shirt, and red tie for his meeting with the dean. The dean hadn't exactly agreed to the meeting, but he hadn't refused the appointment either. Mark's family was well known as supporters of education and often made large donations to schools. The dean may not want shifters at his school, but he wasn't opposed to taking their money, a fact that irritated Mark more than just about anything else, other than discrimination. Mark jumped into his Lexus ISC, a treat he'd bought himself after winning his first big case last year. The silver convertible was impractical, gorgeous, and his favorite possession. It was one of the few things he owned that revealed the amount of money he had. He drove with the top down, His hair might be a mess, but he needed the freedom of the wind whooshing past him. The swift car got him to the university with 20 minutes to spare. Rather than go straight to the dean's office, he wandered around campus. It was only a little after 9, but the campus was crawling with students and professors headed to classes. Mark sat on a bench to people watch, smelling the air as people walked in front of him on the sidewalk. Not a single shifter walked by him in the 15 minutes he sat there. Unusual at a school this size, he thought, his interest piqued. He rose and ambled toward the dean's office, again sniffing the air when someone would walk by him. Nothing but the unmistakable aura of humans met his nostrils. He walked up a set of stairs to the second floor, following signs pointing him in the direction of the dean's office. A sign on the door proclaimed the dean's name, Dean Charles Wormer. Mark lifted an eyebrow. The name was familiar to him, but he wasn't sure why. As he entered, he was greeted by a lovely older woman when he entered the waiting area for the dean's office, who asked for his name. Mark Anderson. I have an appointment to speak with Dean Wormer at 9:30. The woman checked her book, smiled, and looked up at him. Of course. Dean Wormer is expecting you. I'll show you in. She rose from her desk, walked to the door of the office, and knocked softly. She did not wait for a response, but opened the door and announced Mark. Show him in, Greta. She turned and gestured for him to go on in. The voice was a tad bit nasally and slightly feminine to Mark's ears, but the man behind the desk who rose to greet him was quite large, both tall and wide. The voice did not match the person. Mark stepped forward and shook his proffered hand. Good morning, Dean Wormer. Mark Anderson. Of course, Mr. Anderson. Please, have a seat. Dean Wormer looked at Greta, an eyebrow raised in question. Would you like coffee for your meeting? She asked. Dean Wormer looked at Mark questioningly, and he shook his head. He returned his eyes to Greta. No thank you, Greta. Greta smiled and left, closing the door behind her. So Mr. Anderson, how can I help you? Well, Dean, I'm here to discuss the denied admission of Annie Daniels. Mark noted the look on the dean's face. His amiable smile drooped into a frown of displeasure. Hammering the nail in now would be to his advantage. I understand you denied her admission on the grounds that she is a shifter. Dean Wormer cleared his throat, never breaking eye contact with Mark. Is that what you understand? Mark nodded but did not speak. Your understanding is false. Would you mind explaining to me what the truth is? The dean leaned forward on his desk. Who are you again? Are you with the press? No, nothing like that, Mark assured him, even though he knew damn well the man knew who he was. Maybe not his profession, but the dean was aware of who his family was at the least. I'm a lawyer. A lawyer? Dean Wormer sat back and chuckled. I assume Ms. Daniels feels she's been discriminated against? Mark affirmed his assumption. I can assure you that is not the case. On what basis did you deny her admission? Our admissions policy is in the school handbook. You may read it at your leisure. I have, Mark said. He reached into the briefcase he'd carried in with him and pulled out a copy of the handbook. He turned to the page and began reading aloud the highlighted section concerning admission requirements. After only 3 sentences, the dean interrupted him. Mr. Anderson, I am well aware of our policy. Then you should also be aware that Ms. Daniels fulfilled and even surpassed most of these requirements. Dean Wormer pursed his lips, steepled his fingers, and stared at Mark silently. Mark waited patiently. After almost a full minute of silence, Dean Wormer spoke. Mr. Anderson, I'm going to have to ask you to leave my office. I'll contact the school's lawyer and have him get in touch with you. Mark sighed as if he was disappointed. I see. All right, Dean Wormer, if that's the way this is going to have to play out, then I'll bring the ball. He handed his card to him. All my contact information is on there. Please make sure he contacts me no later than tomorrow at noon. Mark rose to leave. The dean did not, his manners forgotten now that he knew what he was dealing with. After Mark left, the dean was on the phone immediately, conferring with the school's lawyer. Mark left the dean's office and meandered around campus for a bit. The campus was beautiful and busy. He wondered if the football team was any good. The buildings were made of the same brick, and each had trees in front and around, shading the campus from the sun. The quad, a large field that looked more like a park, had students lazing about on blankets, some studying, others visiting. A handful were playing soccer. And as far as Mark could tell, not one was a shifter. He sat down on a bench again and watched. A young woman sat next to him and smiled. "Hi," she said. "Hi. My friend and I were wondering if you're the new lit prof?" Mark laughed. "No, ma'am. I'm a lawyer visiting the campus." "Oh. You don't look old enough to have a kid going here," she commented flirtatiously. "Thank God," he replied with a smile. He turned toward her a little. "Can I ask you a couple questions about the school?" The girl shrugged happily. "Sure. I've noticed most of the students are human. Are there any shifters who go here?" The girl looked around, her blonde ponytail following the movement of her head. I never really thought about it. I don't know any shifters." "That's kind of weird." "Why is that weird?" "Well, I went to high school here, and there were shifters in all my classes. But not one of them goes to school here." "Is it typical for kids who grow up here to attend this school?" "Yeah, I guess." She shrugged again. "A lot of people do, anyway." Mark opened his mouth to ask another question, but a burly boy in surfer shorts interrupted. "Casey, who's this guy?" Casey looked up. "Hi, Greg. This is..." She looked at Mark. "I'm sorry, I didn't get your name." Again Greg interrupted before Mark could answer. "His name doesn't matter, Casey. He's a shifter, can't you tell?" Casey looked confused. "I didn't notice." "Why does it matter?" "Shifters don't belong here." Mark chuckled as he stood. "Why's that, Greg?" "Because shifters are lower than humans." "Greg!" Casey admonished. She looked at Mark apologetically. "Be quiet, Casey," Greg told her without looking at her. "Screw you," Casey said as she walked away. Mark watched her walk away and returned his attention to Greg. "Looks like you lost your date for the weekend." "If she prefers shifters, I don't want her." Mark rolled his eyes. "You're an idiot. I'll be leaving now." He turned to leave, but Greg grabbed his shoulder and pulled him back. Mark glared at him. "Listen, kid, let's not have a problem." Greg shoved him. Mark shifted and roared. Everyone on the quad turned. The lion roared again, causing Greg to fall over backward in his attempt to move away from the lion. Mark stood over him, growling, then licked his face. He gagged a little at the taste and pretended he might throw up on Greg's face. Greg squealed loudly and backpedaled on his hands and feet, crab-like. Mark chortled, a sort of snuffling sound, as he turned and headed for his car. He picked through his torn clothes, mourning the loss of his favorite suit, and found the keys. He carried them in his mouth as he ambled across campus in his lion form, scaring a few of the students. Most just watched him walk by, some called out, and a couple even touched his mane as if they were old friends. Mark enjoyed putting on the little show, especially when he saw the dean walking briskly toward him with 2 large security guards behind. They reached him just as he reached his car. "Mr. Anderson, what is the meaning of this?" the dean yelled, red from anger. Mark shifted and stood proudly naked in front of the trio of men. Dean Wormer averted his eyes as if embarrassed by the fact that a naked man stood in front of him. "One of your students accosted me and was very rude. I had to put him in his place. How dare you shift on this campus? And stand here without clothes for everyone to see? Have you no shame?" "Not really," Mark replied. "What I do have is a case against your school. You'll be hearing from me again, Dean Wormer." Mark opened the door of his car and climbed in. He pulled out of the parking space and rolled down the window. "Make sure your lawyer calls me tomorrow." He winked, put on his sunglasses, and drove away. "Leah!" Annie yelled. "Leah! It is 6 o'clock. Mark will be here in an hour and you haven't even showered." Leah frowned as Annie crashed into the room yelling. She's been lost in her writing. She'd never written a screenplay, and it required a lot more effort than a novel. "What?" Annie rolled her eyes, walked to the desk, and pushed the laptop closed. "You have 1 hour to get ready for your date with Mark." Leah's eyes cleared, then widened. "Oh shit! I lost track of time." She jumped up and headed for her bedroom, Annie following close behind. "I've already laid out what you should wear on your bed," Annie informed her as she stripped out of her clothes and turned on the shower. Leah glanced at the bed and saw the typical little black dress, one she had never seen before. "That's not mine." "It's mine. You have nothing sexy in that closet. All you have is jeans and tees and some summer dresses, which are really cute, actually." "Why can't I wear jeans and a sexy top?" Leah asked. "Because you don't have one. We are so going shopping soon. You need a completely new wardrobe." Leah grumbled as she climbed into the shower. "I don't go anywhere where I need fancy clothes." "Too bad. We're going. Now hurry up. I'll do your hair and makeup." Leah continued to grumble to herself. Her nerves were on fire all of a sudden, which was stupid. She'd already slept with the man. It was just a date. But she hadn't been on a date in so long, she was scared she wouldn't know what to do. "I'll figure it out as I go," she thought to herself as she climbed out and reached for a towel. Mark knocked on her door at precisely 8 o'clock with a bouquet of flowers in his hand. When she opened the door, his smile widened. "Wow. You look," he shook his head. "You're the writer. What word do I need?" Leah lifted one corner of her mouth and sarcastically replied, "Dazzling. Ravishing. Bewitching. Any of those will do. I prefer all 3. You dazzle me, I want to ravish you, and I am completely bewitched by you," he said. He handed her the flowers and leaned in for a kiss. Annie giggled and put her hand over her mouth, but the interruption had occurred. Leah looked at her, an eyebrow arched. Annie's eyes widened innocently. "What? It's so adorable." Leah handed her the flowers. "Go put these in a vase. See you later." "Yeah, like in the morning," Annie said with a smirk. "Shut up," Leah said as she pushed Mark out and closed the door with a definitive snap. She turned to him and smiled. "Ready to go?" "Of course," he said, smothering a laugh at the exchange. "The 2 of you may not be biological sisters, but you sure act like you are. We've grown exceptionally close." Occasionally, though, I wish I'd sent her to an orphanage, Leah joked, shaking her head. I'm kidding, of course. Mark shook his head as he opened the passenger side door of his Lexus. Your sense of humor is a bit off color, but I like it. Thank God, because I'm not going to change it, she said as she climbed in. The smell of leather was intoxicating. She'd always liked the smell of a clean, new car. When he got in and started the engine, it practically purred. Is this a new car? I've had it almost a year. A treat after winning a big case, he told her. I hope you like seafood. I love seafood, actually. Where are we going? She asked. It's a surprise. We are driving into the city, though, he told her as he turned onto the road and headed for the interstate. A long car ride. What will we talk about? Anything you want, sexy lady. I enjoy the sound of your voice, he complimented. Leah laughed and shook her head, and he pointed at her. That right there is probably the sexiest thing I think I've ever heard. So low and smoky. Are you sure you're not a writer? You use words like a wordsmith, Leah told him. Nah. I'm just good with the ladies, Mark replied. Oh God, Leah said, almost snorting. You don't have to call me a god. I'm just a normal man with supernormal powers. He glanced at her and wiggled his eyebrows. But if you really want to, I won't stop you. Leah laughed as they followed the entrance ramp onto the highway that led into the city. Dinner was exquisite, Leah claimed as they waited for the valet to bring the car around. She held a to-go box with 2 desserts he'd ordered even though they were both stuffed with expensive lobster bisque, shrimp scampi, and stuffed crab. Thank you. Mark smiled, lifted her hand to his lips, and kissed her knuckles. My pleasure, sexy lady. He stepped down to the curb as the car pulled to a stop in front of them to open her door. He walked around the front of the car and tipped the driver, calling good night to him and his cohorts. So, what would you like to do now? He asked. I'm not sure, she commented, then brightened. Actually, I do know. I want to see the cabin you've rented. I've heard it's outrageously beautiful inside. Oh, it's a treat for the eyes, my friend, he laughed. Can I be nosy? That's what first dates are for. Well, that, and for feeling out if a girl does it on the first date. You already know that answer, she said smartly, poking his side none too gently. Hey! That tickles! Do you want to cause a crash? Whatever, smarty pants. So what's the question, nosy butt? He asked. Leah rolled her eyes. So I looked you up on the internet when I was supposed to be writing today. You won a really high-profile case last year. Similar to Annie's. Similar but not the same. Annie is suing a school for discrimination, while that guy sued an apartment complex for the same reason. Right. And you won, so I know you got a nice retainer fee. But that doesn't explain the car, which I know is high, and the cabin, which I also know rents for a pretty price for only a week. You are nosy, he laughed. My parents are Thomas and Nicole Anderson. Leah's eyes widened. As in the man who created Farkeep? The computer company? That's the one, Mark replied. Holy shit. Mark laughed. You sound disgusted. No, not at all. You just don't act like someone who has billions, Leah said. I don't have billions, technically. My parents do, but one day it'll be mine, Mark said, nodding sagely as if he'd imparted some great wisdom. That's right, they're shifters, Leah said with a snap of her fingers. They donate tons of money for shifter rights and education and such. Yes, ma'am. They taught me to fight for what I believed in. So I became a lawyer. I take on any case, no matter how small, so that shifters can have the same rights as humans. Leah stared at him, his eyes were fierce and hardcore belief in what he did. A newfound respect blossomed in her heart and mind for him. She took his hand in hers and smiled at him. You're so passionate. It's nice to see someone who cares that much about others. Somebody has to do it. And honestly, it's not that hard of a job anymore. Not like it used to be, Mark said. Your parents must be proud of the work you do, Leah said. They are, Mark beamed. So what about your parents? My parents died a long time ago. Annie and I are both orphans, Leah told him. I'm sorry. She waved her hand. Don't be. We take care of each other. That's awesome, he smiled. A silence filled the car as their thoughts moved around inside. Leah felt a connection with this man, and it terrified her. But she couldn't bring herself to pull back as she had with all other relationships. Something about this man captured her, held her to him. She looked at him sideways, trying to figure it out. Yeah, he was good-looking, and funny, and charming, and kind, and passionate, and a damn good lay. Leah rolled her eyes at herself. She just listed every reason why she should have feelings for him. She broke the silence to escape her thoughts. So how much longer until we get to the cabin?
Chapter 5. The cabin Mark had rented was twice the size of Leah's, and so much more elegant and lavish than she had ever guessed. She'd walked through the forest and peered at the inaptly named cabin a time or two when it had been empty, but she'd never approached it to look in the windows no matter how much she wanted to. Her curiosity had burned, but she had held it in check. She was more than excited to finally not only get close to the structure but to go inside as well. The front porch stretched across the entire front of the cabin and wrapped around one side. At the side was a set of stairs that led to a balcony on the second floor that overlooked the lake. 2 rocking chairs sat up there for comfortable evening chats with a glass of wine. Huge bay windows were behind the chairs and would reflect the sun beautifully. The wood of the walls was dark and sumptuous, and beautifully integrated into the forest behind it. Wow, she said, her voice revealing the awe she felt. It's stunning. You're just renting it. Yes, until the case is over anyway. He answered as they mounted the stairs, and he unlocked the door. Too bad, she mused as she stepped inside and froze. The inside, if possible, was even more unbelievable than the outside. Breathtaking, Mark chuckled. It is that for sure. Leah looked back at him. Was it furnished? Yes, I only brought clothes with me. There's a cleaning crew who come once a week and keep the place spotless. Part of the rent, Mark said with a shrug. Leah shook her head, amazed. I don't even want to imagine what this place costs to rent for as long as you might be here. I can afford it, Mark bragged with a wink. You probably can too, published author. Even if I could, I probably wouldn't, Leah said with a laugh. Mark wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against him. He gently placed his lips against hers. Instead of renting it yourself, you could just stay here with me, like a little mini vacation. I kinda like the sound of that, Leah said, running her hands up and down his back. She cupped his ass and pulled his pelvis against her. Her eyes widened, and she said, Why, Mr. Anderson? Is that a roll of quarters in your pocket? Or are you just happy to see me? A roll of quarters. Lady, you're going to pay for that. Before she could even consider escaping, he gently kicked her feet out from under her and lowered her to the floor. He straddled her and began to tickle her belly mercilessly. She screamed and laughed, wiggling around and trying to get away from him. She grabbed his wrists but could not stop him, and her legs were useless since he was sitting on them. Stop! Stop! She squealed in between her raucous laughter. I'm going to pee, I swear. Mark laughed and relented. I can't have you peeing on the carpet. The owners would be furious. They said no pets. Then why did they rent to you, Lion Man? Do you want the tickling to start again? Leah vigorously shook her head, laughing at his pretend offense. You better watch your words. She ran her hands up under his shirt, dragging her fingernails from his pecs to his abs, a look of seduction on her face.
Hi there, unfortunately we've had to take this steamy scene out as it's against YouTube's terms of service.
If you don't want to miss out on love scenes in future stories, check the description and join Romancely Audio Velvet. If you're already a member, the love scene reference is Baby for the Lion, Chapter 5, Love Scene 2.
Okay, back to the story.
Oh, good Lord, Leah said with a shake of her head. You're positively incorrigible. I like a woman who can use big words, he replied. Come on, let's go upstairs. If you love the living room, you'll die when you see the bedroom. As they walked toward the stairs, Leah's phone rang. She paused with a frown on her face. That's Annie's ringtone. She turned around and picked her purse up off the floor where she'd dropped it when he'd been tickling her. She wouldn't call unless it was important. I'm sorry. Don't be, Mark said, watching the concern on Leah's face. Annie. Leah listened for a few seconds, her eyes widening more and more. Mark could hear the hysterical Annie on the other end. Annie, calm down. I can't understand you. She listened again. Okay. Take Jenny and go to my room. Lock that door too. A minute later she hung up. We have to go to my house. Now. Leah was already headed for the door as she spoke. Wait a second. What's going on? Mark hurried after her and grabbed her hand. Someone threw rocks at the house and broke some windows. Annie was home and she's freaking out. We have to get there. What if they come back? Leah's voice had risen an octave. She wasn't panicked yet, but she was close. Okay. Calm down. Mark began to undress. Leah gaped at him. What the hell are you doing? I don't want to ruin these clothes, he explained as his pants dropped to the floor and he stepped out of them. I'm going to shift, you're going to climb onto my back, and I'll run to your house. Are you out of your mind? She screeched. Just drive me. He was completely naked. He put his hand on his shoulders. Think about this. If we drive, it takes almost 15 minutes because of the route we have to take around the forest. I can run with you on my back and be there in less than 10. Are you sure? I'm positive. Now do what I say so we can get to your friend. Hold on to my mane for dear life. Mark shifted. He hurried out the door and motioned for her to shut it. He turned his side to her so she could climb on as if he were a horse. Leah hesitated only a moment before climbing on. She had known he was tall, but her feet didn't touch the ground once she'd adjusted on his back. She clenched her thighs around him, grabbed his mane, and told him she was ready. The speed with which he ran rivaled a racehorse. She had no idea the actual speed, but she felt as if they were flying. The muscles of his lion body bunched and released under her legs, and briefly she thought about how she'd like to ride him again when she wasn't scared out of her mind with worry. As promised, less than 10 minutes later they were at her front door. Leah leapt off his back and sprinted for the door, calling Annie's name loudly so she'd come open the door. Annie appeared almost immediately, Jenny right behind her barking like mad. She jerked the door open and flew into Leah's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Leah comforted her as Mark slipped by and walked to the bathroom to find a towel to wrap himself in. Calm down, sweetie. Calm down, Leah comforted quietly, holding her tightly. Oh, Leah. It scared me so badly. The car drove right up to the porch. The rocks crashed through 3 windows, and they were yelling and saying awful things. Okay, let's get you calmed down, then we'll talk about it, Leah said. Mark walked back into the room with a towel around his waist. Annie looked up and saw him. A watery smile crossed her face. Nice outfit. This old thing. She laughed softly, and he walked over and wrapped an arm around her. She leaned into him briefly, and Leah said, Let's go to the kitchen and sit down. I'll make some coffee and we'll call the police. They trooped to the kitchen, Jenny wagging her tail as she sat down next to Mark. Leah glared at her. Jenny, you are such a traitor. Mark rubbed Jenny's head. She knows a kindred spirit when she meets one. Whatever, Leah mumbled. Okay, coffee's on. I'm gonna go get the rocks. Mark, will you please call the police? I left them on the floor. Leah retrieved the rocks from the living room floor, mentally cursing the idiots who had scared Annie and broken her windows. She glanced down at one of the rock, which had a note attached. Her eyes narrowed and her face reddened at the absolute bigotry written on the paper in black letters. She actually growled. Police are called and coffee is ready, Mark said as she walked back into the kitchen. She put the rock with the note on the table with a loud thud in front of him. The other two she held on to. He read the note, his jaw clenching. What shitheads? Are the police on the way? Leah asked. Yes, but I'll tell you now. There's not much they can do unless Annie saw the license plate or the bastards who threw the rocks. Annie shook her head. I was in the living room, but I didn't see anything. I just ducked. Leah patted her hand. That's exactly what you should have done, sweetie. An hour later, the police had come and gone, saying exactly what Mark had told them they would. Leah was frustrated, but there was really nothing they could do. She did, however, plan to build a fence around the house, and possibly put up a fence and gate at the end of the lengthy driveway. Wouldn't stop everybody, but most people wouldn't trespass on property guarded by a gate and fence. Why don't the two of you stay at my place tonight? Mark offered. We can cover the windows and have them repaired tomorrow. I'm really not comfortable leaving the house open like that. Anyone could put their hand through, unlock the window, and come in. Exactly. That's why you should stay with me, Mark insisted. But Leah was shaking her head before he finished. He sighed. Okay, I'll stay here. You don't have to, Leah said. I know, but I want to. Leah, I'd like it if he stayed. I'm not sure I'm going to sleep at all, but I might if he were here, Annie said. Leah sighed. Yeah, okay. She looked at Mark. It's not that I don't want you to, Mark. I just don't want to put you out. You aren't putting me out. He squirmed in his chair. I do wish I had some clothes, though. 3 weeks later, Mark had built a case against the university. A strong one considering he'd found 3 other shifters who had been denied admission to Glenrose University without cause. He and Annie were sitting at the table in Leah's kitchen, looking at the statements from the other students, all of whom had agreed to go to court. Annie, this case is strong, but it's your decision, Mark told her after she'd finished reading the statements. Your case is stronger than these other shifters because you were valedictorian and belong to so many groups. There is absolutely no reason a small university would deny you. What about these other guys? 2 of them were in the top quarter of their class, and 1 was in the top 10. Most colleges would take them, but all colleges like to get valedictorians. You could have gone anywhere in the state and been accepted. Gotcha, Annie murmured, her thoughts a little scrambled. Leah had told her this morning that the decision was completely hers, and she wouldn't be interfering this morning. Besides, Annie had heard her throwing up that morning and didn't want to bother her. She assumed Leah would go back to bed, but she had kissed Mark hello and gone to her office to work instead. Listen, Annie, you don't have to make a decision today, but we're going to need to move on this soon. The school's lawyer has contacted me and would like to meet. Why? Discuss options, Mark informed her. May I make a suggestion? She nodded. Let's set up a meeting with them and see what they have to say. We can make a decision then. Annie nodded again. I like that idea. When can we meet? I'll call today and set up a time. I'd say tomorrow or the next day. Sounds good, Annie answered as Leah wandered into the kitchen. Annie looked at her, frowning. There was something different about her, but she couldn't figure out what it was. Everything okay in here? Leah asked as she reached into the fridge for a water. Perfect. Listen, babe, I've got to run. How about dinner tonight? Mark asked as he grabbed Leah and dipped her. You dork, she cried as he lifted her back up straight. What time? Come to my place. I'll cook for you. Leah's eyebrows rose into her hairline. What? You cook? Don't sound so surprised. I am a man. I grill like a champion, he replied with a grin. He walked to the door but stopped before leaving. Just an FYI. If you want anything other than meat, you'd better bring it. I only grill, she yelled after him as he left. You caveman. Annie had been watching the exchange, keeping her eyes on Leah more than on Mark. Her frown of perplexity hadn't left her face, and Leah looked at her strangely. Why are you looking at me like that? You look different, Annie murmured. She walked over to her and sniffed. You smell different too. Leah was taken aback. What? Smell different? Like what? Leah raised an arm and sniffed, but she'd put on deodorant that morning. She smelled her hair. I smell like I always do. No, you smell like a shifter, Annie mused, her fingers on her lips as she thought. Well, that's weird. Maybe because I'm sleeping with Mark? His scent rubbed off on me? Leah wondered. Anyway, I'm hungry. Want something? I heard you throw up this morning. I thought you didn't feel good? Annie said, her eyes widening as she realized what was happening. She waited for Leah to come to the same conclusion. I was just nauseous, I guess. I'm famished now, Leah said. She pulled out a stack of lunch meat and cheese and began building a sandwich as thick as a table leg. Have you gained weight? Leah's head jerked up. How rude. Leah, have you? I don't know. You know I never weight myself. She continued making her sandwich, moving with abrupt movements in her irritation. Then she froze. She dropped the bread she'd been holding and slowly turned to Annie. Holy shit. Annie nodded at her. I knew it would hit you after a few minutes. It can't be. But it can. Leah stood where she was for several seconds, contemplating the glaring truth. She was pregnant. She looked at Annie. Do humans smell different when they're pregnant? They do if they're pregnant with a shifter baby, Annie told her. I learned that in an anatomy class. Oh my God. I don't know anything about having a human baby, let alone a shifter baby, Leah said, a slight note of panic in her voice. Annie walked to her and took her hand. She led her to the table and sat her down. What you need to do right now is call your doctor and go see her. You need to find out how far along you are. Leah's fingers drummed the table nervously, and her leg bounced. She nodded her head at Annie, who brought the phone to her so she could call. Without much thought, she found her doctor in her contacts and pressed send. She explained to the receptionist that she was sure she was pregnant with a shifter's baby, and an appointment was made for her that afternoon at 3. Leah frowned after she disconnected. I have an appointment at 3. I normally can't get in to see her with so little notice. Yeah, but this isn't just a checkup, Leah. Shifter/human pregnancies can be high risk. And the gestation is so short. What do you mean? Annie rolled her eyes. Leah, don't you read any magazines? Shifter pregnancies only last 10 weeks. Leah's eyes widened, and the color dropped from her face. Her hands began to shake. The panic attack was imminent. Annie saw this and rushed to her side. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought you would have at least heard that before, or I would have told you more gently, she said. She pushed Leah's head between her knees, but she shoved her hand away. Drive me? She asked when she'd calmed down. Of course. Yep, you're pregnant. Congratulations. Her doctor had administered a urine test first thing, which had shown positive like a lighthouse in the dark sky. Leah drew a deep breath, closed her eyes, and released it slowly. What happens now? Well, we need to do a sonogram so I can see how far along you are. Based on the sudden weight gain, I'd say at least 4 weeks. Have you been nauseous? Just yesterday and today. I thought I had a virus or something. Are you sure it's a shifter baby? Leah curled her lip in offense. 100%. The doctor, her friend for years, lifted her hands in a defensive gesture and chuckled. I have to ask, Leah. We treat shifter/human pregnancies differently. Why? The doctor shrugged her shoulders. Sometimes they're high risk. A human woman's body isn't really prepared for a gestation period of 10 weeks. Our bodies prefer 40. Am I in danger? Is the baby in danger? Leah put a protective hand over her belly. You shouldn't be, and neither should your baby. You're healthy. Take care of yourself. I'll have to see you every few days from now on, just to be safe. Yeah, okay. Leah's mind was spinning as she laid back and pulled the paper gown up so the doctor could do the sonogram. What would she say to Mark? How would she tell him? What would he do? Leah knew he cared for her, and she cared for him as well. But a baby? She sighed as the doctor moved the sonogram device over her belly. A thumping noise erupted from the machine. Leah gasped, then chuckled. A happy, proud tear escaped her eye. She watched as weird images flashed onto the screen. The doctor pointed to part of the image. Here is your baby's head, and here the arms and legs. Can you tell if it's a boy or girl? Not yet. Next week we should be able to, though. Leah laughed. I have to admit, I was terrified at first. But look at that sweetie. I love the look on a new mother's face the first time she hears that heartbeat sound and sees the life inside her. Leah had an abrupt thought. Do shifter babies come out looking human or in their shifter form? I've only delivered human forms. Sometimes they have fur or feathers, but their features are always human. Oh, okay. As she listened to the heartbeat for another moment, she smiled. She didn't care what Mark said about this or what he did. She wanted this baby now. Deep down, though, she was sure Mark would want to be a part of this as well. She just had to decide how that would look.
Chapter 6. Annie had gone shopping for a professional-looking outfit for the meeting with the dean and his lawyer. She hadn't wanted to look like a little girl playing dress-up, so she had chosen a skirt suit in professional gray paired with a black blouse and black heels. She looked in the mirror. Minimalistic makeup and a sleek ponytail finished the look. A young lawyer was reflected back at her. She giggled to herself as she put on her earrings. What's so funny? Leah asked from her bedroom. Annie was dressing in her room because the lighting was better. Annie stepped into the bedroom and twirled in her heels. I was just thinking I look like a lawyer. Leah nodded, a grin on her face. You do, kind of. Except I know you're only 18. Almost 19, Annie reminded her. I so hope the baby comes on my birthday. That would be so neat. It would be, but I think your birthday is about 2 weeks too early, Leah said. She rose and walked over to Annie to adjust her collar. Please don't say anything to Mark. He's coming over for dinner tonight. I plan to tell him then. Annie pursed her lips. I won't tell. What do you think he'll do? I have no idea. Leah said with a laugh. I think he's going to ask you to marry him, Annie pronounced as she reached for her bag. Walk me out. Leah followed her through the house, blocking Jenny from getting anywhere near Annie. Married? I don't think so. You don't think he'll ask or you don't want him to? Both. You don't want to get married? Not right now, Annie. I like my life just the way it is. Annie smirked. You have, 5 weeks before your life goes through a complete overhaul. Might as well do all the changing at once. Leah laughed nervously. Oh my God. You're right. She put her hand on her forehead. Everything will change whether Mark and I are married or not. Annie shook her head. You are the smartest woman I know, but seriously, sometimes you're so dull. Leah slapped Annie playfully on the arm. Shut up. I just found out I'm pregnant. This morning, actually. Give me another hour to think of all the contingencies. Jenny let out a joyful bark. Mark's car had just pulled into the driveway. Annie looked at Leah and wiggles her eyebrows. There's your hubby now. I will break your arm if you say something like that again, Leah said without heat. Annie stuck her tongue out. This idle threat was common between the two of them when they were teasing each other. Mark stepped inside without knocking and saw the pair of them standing there. His smile brightened. What a beautiful pair of women. Leah moved into his arms for a hug and kiss. Annie giggled and asked, Do you have a brother or cousin or handsome uncle who's close to your age? Mark laughed and winked at her. I have a cousin who is just your age. She's lovely, although I don't think she's a lesbian. Leah laughed at the look on Annie's face, which was a cross between offended and pouty. Mark soothed, just kidding, gorgeous. I actually do have 2 cousins your age. They're twins, a boy and a girl. Really? Annie said, stretching the word out to show her interest. And when, exactly, can I meet this handsome cousin? I'll work on it, Mark promised. He's in Brazil right now. He's an archaeologist. Oh my God, your own personal Indiana Jones. Leah exclaimed. Right up your alley. Annie gazed off, pretending to be in love. Can you see the hearts drifting out of my eyes? Leah and Mark laughed at her. Mark kissed Leah and whispered, She's something else, I'll tell you that. Yes, she is, Leah agreed. I forgot my license in my other bag. I'll be right back, Annie announced as she left the room. Leah looked at Mark, who wrapped his arms around her and kissed her again. I do love kissing you, pretty lady. And I love kissing you, sweet man, Leah answered and locked her lips on his again. What are you doing tonight? I was hoping I'd be making some sweet love to you at some point. He finished his comment with a squeeze of her ass. What do you say? Leah giggled and wiggled out of his arms. How about some dinner first? Then we'll see if you get lucky. I'm already lucky. I get to eat dinner with you, Mark charmed. Oh, good Lord. Can we go before I vomit? Annie asked teasingly as she walked back into the kitchen, tucking her license in the wallet she had chosen that matched her outfit. Mark looked at her sternly. 5 seconds ago you were begging to meet my cousin, who, I might add, is much more charming than I am. Charming, or schmoozy? Annie asked. Is that even a word? Leah asked with a smile. She understood the context, and she could tell Mark understood it too. It is now, Annie exclaimed. Do you want to win this case? Mark lifted a brow at her. She giggled and nodded. Then you better watch the attitude. Yes, sir. Annie mockingly saluted him. Leah interrupted before he could make another comment. All right. The 2 of you are going to be late if you keep this up. Argue in the car. Yes, Mom, Annie answered, kissing Leah on the cheek. Leah's eyes widened a little, and Annie's did too when she realized her mistake. Mark had only laughed, thinking she'd meant it exactly as she intended and not in reference to anything else. Leah visibly relaxed. Ha ha. Get out of here. Mark kissed her once more and walked out. Leah slapped Annie playfully on the butt. Watch what you say, dork. He didn't get it, Annie said with a roll of her eyes. Leah shook her head as Annie followed Mark to the car. Her thoughts remained on the word Annie had used. Mom. Small bubbles of panic erupted in her brain. I'm going to be a mom, she thought, the voice in her head a higher pitch and breathless. She put her hands on the counter to balance herself, took a deep breath, and said it out loud, forcing her voice to be calm. I'm going to be a mom. The panic ebbed a little. Facing it head-on rather than letting her thoughts run away was the best course of action for her. But she could still feel the anxiety. She wasn't just nervous. She was anxious. Anxious about the discussion she'd be having with Mark later that evening. Anxious about his response. What if he wanted to get married? What if he didn't want to have anything to do with the baby? Both questions scared her to death, because either answer was terrifying to her. She didn't want to get married. But she didn't want to raise a baby on her own. Sure, she could do it. That wasn't the point. She didn't want to do it. A child needed two parents. Both she and Annie had spent the majority of their lives without parents. The idea of her baby, boy or girl, living without her and without the father was frightening. So now she knew how she'd start the conversation with Mark. She'd tell him she was pregnant, and then her next sentence would depend on his reaction, honestly. She couldn't plan this conversation out like she did for her characters. She had no idea what he would say, so she couldn't prepare her lines. How frustrating real people in the real world are, she thought. Leah shook her head to clear it. She grabbed a bottle of water and walked to her office, Jenny following close behind. She had decided because she couldn't control the real world, she'd go create a world with words that she could control. Mark, the baby, and the discussion was shoved to the back of her mind as she began typing. On the drive to the university, where they would be meeting with the dean and the university's lawyer, Mark coached Annie, explaining that it would be best if she didn't say much for now. He had no idea how this meeting would go, or even what they wanted to discuss. "I know they don't want to go to court," Mark informed her. "So I'm not sure what they think this meeting will accomplish." "Why don't they want to go to court?" "They'll lose," Mark answered simply. Once they'd arrived, they were ushered into the dean's office. Annie shook their hands, although the dean did nothing to hide the grimace that crossed his face. Annie's lip curled in derision. She did not like to be treated as if she were dirty. But she kept her mouth shut despite every urge to say something tacky. Throughout the meeting, the three men talked around her. Honestly, Mark and the university's lawyer, Scott Trimble, spoke. Dean Wormer listened intently, speaking occasionally if asked a question. Annie listened as well, and abruptly the meaning of the meeting was made clear to her. She sat up, focused on Trimble when he addressed her. "So, Ms. Daniels, what do you think?" He had a smarmy grin on his handsomely lined face. He was used to talking his way into and out of things, she could tell. "Let me get this straight, Mr. Trimble. Are you offering me a bribe?" "A bribe?" Trimble scoffed. "What an ugly word, Ms. Daniels." "No, what we're offering is a settlement." Annie glanced at Mark. He inclined his head, indicating she'd do the talking now. Annie appreciated his confidence in her. "A settlement? What does that mean, exactly?" Trimble smiled indulgently at her as if she weren't terribly bright. "What it means is we give you a handsome settlement, and you drop the lawsuit and go to school elsewhere, which I understand you're doing anyway." "I am taking classes, yes. So I drop the lawsuit and go away." "What about other shifters who want to go to this school?" Annie asked. Mark smiled, proud of her. Trimble and the dean exchanged looks. The dean sat forward and spoke. "Other shifters aren't your concern, young lady. What you need to worry about is you." Annie lifted an eyebrow, disgust on her face. "You're not going to let shifters attend this school, are you?" "Like I said, that's none of your concern," the dean repeated, staring at her. Annie sat back, pondering his answer. She let silence hang in the room while she thought. If she dropped this lawsuit, shifters would be discriminated against and would not be allowed to attend Glenrose University. She smiled a slow smile. "How much is the settlement? And from whose pocket will the money be paid?" Trimble grinned, sure they had one. Mark watched Annie, eyes narrowed. She was up to something, he was sure, but he let her run the meeting. Trimble named a figure, rather low in Annie's opinion, and said, "The money is out of the university's pockets." "Huh. So the university has a hush fund?" The dean sat forward again. "No, we do not. We have an activity fund that is used at the discretion of the dean. That's interesting, Annie mused. She rose from her chair, Mark right behind her. Your attempt at a settlement is pathetic. You're bigots, and I don't believe bigotry should rule this world, even if the bigots do have discretionary funds. I refuse your bribe, because, let's be honest, gentlemen, that's exactly what you're trying to do. We'll see you in court. Annie turned and walked out of the office without another word. Mark looked at the two men. You won't win against her, gentlemen, not with the fire she has inside her. I'll contact the judge to set up a court date. Good day. Leah, you should have seen me. You'd be so proud. Annie had burst through the door yelling for her, excited to tell her what had happened. I am proud of you, and I didn't even see it. Leah looked at Mark. So, I guess we're going to court. Yes, ma'am. Annie refused the settlement, Mark said with a smile. You mean bribe, Annie reminded him as she plucked a baby tomato out of the salad Leah was preparing for dinner. Leah slapped at her hand with the spoon but missed. Don't put your grubby hands in the salad, she admonished with a wink. When is the court date? I'm going to call tomorrow and set up a date. I'm hoping we don't actually have to go to trial. What do you mean? Annie asked. I thought that was our only option now. Nah. We can meet in the judge's chambers with all parties involved and settle it there. If that fails, we'll go to trial. But I really don't think they'll go to trial, Mark assured them. Why not? Trials are costly and can be embarrassing in these types of cases. Reporters love stories of discrimination, Mark said with a grin. Good. They deserve to be embarrassed. Did you hear how that butthole spoke to me? Annie grumbled. Mark nodded. But I stood up for myself. Anyway, Leah, I made plans with some friends tonight, so I won't be home for dinner. Leah smiled gratefully at Annie. That's fine. I really only made enough for Mark and me anyway. I am so unloved, Annie cried dramatically. Whatever. Now get your crap and get out of the house. Do you see how she treats me? After all I do for her, Annie said to Mark. Ah well, a martyr's life is never easy. She turned and slumped out of the room as if she were the most dejected creature. Leah looked at Mark. Teenagers. Jesus, he said. You don't know the half of it, she replied with a chuckle. You left some clothes here last time and I washed them if you want to change. Oh, thank God. I thought I would have to wear this all night, Mark commented as he left the room. Before or after dinner, Leah wondered as she stirred the pasta and the marinara and meat sauce she'd whipped up. She'd been craving pasta every day for a week, she'd realized, and now she knew why. As she contemplated the best moment to tell him, it came to her, while they were swimming after dinner. She grinned to herself, thinking how perfect that would be. They would both be relaxed, they'd had their best discussion to date while swimming. Annie walked into the kitchen with a bag slung over her shoulder. She glanced around and asked, "Where's Mark?" "He's changing," Leah answered. "Good luck," Annie said, wrapping an arm around her and squeezing her shoulders. "I think he's going to take it way better than you think." "Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of," Leah murmured. Annie sighed. "Just do what feels right for you and the baby. Marriage, not marriage, whatever, it doesn't matter. But Mark will want to be a part of the baby's life. You know that, right?" "I know. He's a good man, Leah." "Yeah, he is, damn it." They laughed together as Mark walked into the room pulling his t-shirt on. "What's so funny?" "Nothing," they said at the same time. They looked at each other and laughed again. Are you sure the two of you aren't related? Mark asked skeptically. Positive. We just spend way too much time together, Leah said. That's right, which is why I'm out of here tonight. Annie lifted a hand in a wave and paused to love on Jenny before leaving. Have a good night. You too. Be careful, Leah called after her as she scooped pasta and sauce onto 2 plates. She'd already put the salad in 2 bowls, so they were ready to eat. Mark glanced at his watch. It's kind of early for dinner. Leah looked at the clock, it was only 5. She giggled and made up an excuse which was really a lie. I skipped lunch. Are you not hungry? After smelling that, I have to eat. Are you kidding? Mark grabbed the salads and headed to the table, Leah following close behind. Besides, I'm a shifter. We're always hungry. Yes. Despite her size, Annie eats as much as a bodybuilder. Always fascinated me, Leah claimed. She wondered if he would notice the small changes in her body, like her belly, which wasn't exactly flat anymore, or her breasts, which had grown almost a cup size in a week if she didn't tell him about the pregnancy. She kind of thought he would. Mark looked at her. What are you grinning about? He kissed her hand and returned to the kitchen. Annie. She's such a character. Mark returned with 2 wine glasses and a bottle, and Leah's eyes widened. How was she going to explain her abstinence from wine tonight? She had no plausible excuse. She watched as he poured the wine and sat down. He lifted his glass and smiled at her. Any success deserves a small toast, don't you think? Leah smiled a small smile. She lifted her glass and clinked it to his but didn't drink. He noticed right away. No wine? Are you feeling okay? Leah sighed. Now was the time for this conversation. She had really wanted to enjoy dinner first. She mentally shrugged, they could eat as they discussed. She put a large bite of pasta into her mouth to prolong her answering his question. Mark stared at her, confused by her behavior. She'd been acting strangely since he'd gotten here. Leah, what's going on? She finished chewing her bite and reached for the water she'd made for herself before sitting down. She swallowed a gulp, took a deep breath, and plunged in. Mark, I have something to tell you, and I don't want you getting upset. I'd planned to do it while we were swimming, but this time feels right. Mark frowned in confusion. His first thought was she had decided to break up with him, which terrified him. The second thought brought a small smile to his face. He leaned toward her and sniffed. The garlic and basil in the sauce was the first scent he drew in, but underneath it, he smelled himself. You're pregnant, he exclaimed. Leah stared at him in shock. How did you know that? First the wine, then the serious tone. And now that I'm paying attention, I can smell it. He clapped his hands in delight, whether because he was right or because he was happy she was pregnant, she wasn't sure. Leah rolled her eyes. Damn it, I forgot about the smell. You know about the smell? Annie told me I was pregnant before I had even thought about that being the reason I was sick the last couple of mornings. How long have you known? Since this morning. Annie told me I'd gained weight and that I smelled like I was pregnant, so I went to the doctor. She did a test and a sonogram. I'm pregnant, Leah said, lifting her hands in an I don't know gesture. Mark leaned forward and took her hands in his. Leah, this is fantastic. You're happy? Why are you surprised? We've talked about how I want a family, Mark reminded her. I didn't expect this to happen now, but I'm not at all upset that it has. So you want this? Leah was skeptical. Even though she told herself not to, she had imagined this conversation. None of her scenarios had been anything like this reality. Of course I do. Mark squared his shoulders. Leah, I am in love with you. Leah's eyes widened and her mouth opened in shock. What? I love you. I've known for a while, actually, but I knew you weren't ready. Mark kissed her knuckles, a smile on his face. Yeah, I'm still not ready, Leah said, pulling her hand free and standing, her dinner forgotten. Mark watched her, amused, as she began to pace. I mean, how can you love me? We've known each other a month. Love doesn't know time, Leah, Mark replied facetiously. She tilted her head at him, a look of irritation on her face. Don't be cute. You know I can't help being cute. A thought popped into his mind. Can you imagine how cute our baby will be? So beautiful the sun will never set, considering who her parents are. Despite the freaking out that wanted to happen in her brain, she smiled at his comment. She will be the most beautiful creature on earth, human, shifter, plain old animal. She? Do you know it's a girl? Mark asked, standing to take her hands, glad the freak-out had been halted. Well, we won't know from the sonogram for a week or two. But I just felt it, you know, she answered. When are you due? Around 5 weeks, give or take. The doctor said all shifter/human babies make their own schedule. Leah smiled and touched her belly gently. Can I touch your belly? Leah laughed. Mark, you've touched every inch of me. Of course you can touch my belly. But she isn't kicking or anything like that. Shifter pregnancies are short. I bet you feel her in the next few days, Mark said as he massaged her belly. He knelt on one knee and placed his ear against her belly, listening intently. He smiled and looked up at her. I know I can't hear her, but I like to pretend. Leah smiled back at him. You're goofy. Mark made a decision. Marry me. Leah stepped back instinctively, and he lifted his hands in surrender. I'm sorry. It just felt right. I'll get a ring and do it again the proper way. Leah had started shaking her head as he spoke. I'm not ready for that at all, Mark. Okay. I'll let it lie for a bit. But we will discuss this again, Leah, Mark told her as he climbed to his feet. Not today, Leah told him. Let's finish eating, okay? I'm starved. We can talk about names, she said with a smile. He giggled like a little boy with a new toy. Names? Should we think of boy names too? Or just girl names? Leah laughed. I don't know for sure it's a girl. I just have a feeling. But a mother's instinct is usually spot on. My mother taught me that, Mark assured her as they sat back down and began to eat. Speaking of my mother, she's been on me about taking you up to meet her and my father. Leah choked on her pasta. What? Mark was amused again. My parents. I've told them about you and they want to meet you. My mother even read your books so the two of you would have something to talk about. She's like that. Leah nodded. Parents are weird. Mark laughed loudly, so loudly, in fact, that Jenny walked into the dining room to check on them. He called, Come here, Jenny. You're going to have a sister. Aren't you excited? He said as he pet her. Her tail wagged and she grinned her doggy grin at him. He continued petting her but returned his attention to Leah. We'll be the weirdest parents around. Just ask our daughter. Or son.
Hey there. Did you know that we've other hot romances like this that we want to release? but we need your help. Subscribing shows us that you're part of our journey and allows us to make more of these stories at a higher quality. So please, my queen, subscribe to the Romancely YouTube channel now. Thanks. Now back to your story. Chapter 7. The case against the university had hit a standstill. The earliest date Mark could get with the judge had been a month after their original meeting with the dean and the lawyer. Annie had, at first, worried over it constantly, but eventually it moved to the back of her mind. Mark wasn't concerned at all over the delay. He told her it was part of being a lawyer. She had rolled her eyes and left the room. 3 weeks after the meeting, Leah was the size of an elephant, or so she kept repeating to Mark and Annie, who assured her every time that she did not look like an elephant. Mark had joked about her being cow size, and she hadn't spoken to him for 2 days. He'd brought her flowers, candy, even a lovely pair of earrings, but nothing had worked, until he brought home her favorite pasta dish from her favorite restaurant. He was completely forgiven after that. She was humming to herself as she hung a framed landscape painting she had painted specifically for the baby's room. A week ago, the doctor had told them she was having a girl, so after some argument over Chloe versus Callista, they had finally settled on Chloe. Leah had painted the letters of her baby's name in bright primary colors and was planning to hang them on the wall over the crib. The walls were an eggshell white, so she could accessorize in any color she chose, and Mark had commented more than once that she'd picked every color. But she liked the variety, the uniqueness of the room. Her sweet baby Chloe would be unique, possibly the only lion shifter/human cross species born in the US and definitely the only one on record. She deserved unique. She and Mark had decided that marriage wasn't the answer right now, and she had agreed that he should move in with her. She had discussed the decision with Annie first, who loved the idea. Besides, she'd be leaving in December to go to a college 200 miles away, so they would have the house to themselves most of the time. Mark had moved in, and together they turned the third bedroom into the baby's room. Leah heard the door open and Annie calling out her name. "I'm in the baby's room." Annie walked in and looked around. "You've done a lot today," she remarked, plopping down in a wooden rocking chair that boasted a muted orange cushion. The walls had been bare this morning when she'd left. Now there were 2 paintings, a mirror, and some bookshelves hanging about. "Are you supposed to be lifting heavy things?" "I didn't lift the bookshelves. Mark was still here to help me." "Oh, okay. Well, it looks really cute." Leah grinned and glanced around at her baby's room. "Wait until I get the letters of her name up and her bed stuff done. You'll want to move in here." "Nah, look at that bed. I'd hang off both ends." Annie chuckled. "Is it time for a break?" Leah sighed and shook her head. "I really do want to get the letters up today. The bedding won't be in until later this week, so I can't do anything about that. Let me help." "That'd be great." Leah smiled at her as she grabbed a hammer and some nails. Annie looked at the wall, then at the letters, the hammer in one hand, nails in the other. "How are we hanging them?" Leah picked up the C and showed Annie the ribbon she'd fastened to the back. "They'll hang by the ribbons." "That is so freaking cute," Annie gushed. "And the giant sunflowers in the corner are my favorite. By the way, I'm going to get some purple ones to add more color." "More color?" Annie asked, surprised. "Don't you think there's enough color in here?" "Not yet," Leah said. Annie laughed and set to work. "I want them spaced evenly, please." "Yes, mother." "Shut up." As Annie hammered, Leah sat down in the rocking chair. Out of nowhere, she'd felt a little faint. She had eaten, she knew, enough for a football player, so that wasn't the cause. She frowned as another wave hit her, and she closed her eyes and willed it to go away. No luck. Annie turned around to ask her if the letter looked straight and gasped. "Leah, you're as white as the walls. What's the matter?" "I'm not sure. I felt faint all of a sudden, and it won't go away." As she spoke, a pain stabbed through her abdomen, and she doubled over with a cry. She looked up at Annie. "Something is wrong." Annie dropped the H and the hammer and hurried to her side. "Ambulance? Or can I drive you?" "You drive me. You can call Mark on the way to the hospital." "Let's go." Annie put one arm around Leah's waist and the other held her arm as she guided her to the Jeep. She put her into the passenger side of the Jeep and ran around to the driver's door, which refused to open for her clumsy hand. She cursed, jerked the door open, and slammed it. As she jammed the key into the ignition, she cursed again when she missed. "Annie, calm down. I'm not bleeding, so it's okay right now." Leah soothed as Annie gunned the engine and did a 180 at a much faster speed than necessary. "I'd rather have a baby, not go to my own funeral." Annie glanced in both directions when she reached the end of the driveway. "Get my phone out and dial Mark. I'll talk to him." Leah sighed and dug through Annie's enormous bag for nearly a minute before locating the phone. She hissed when Annie took a corner at an unusually high rate. "Damn it, girl. Slow down." "Okay, call Mark and give me the phone," Annie said. The needle on the speedometer lowered by a fraction. Annie held her hand out for the phone. "I'll talk to him. You concentrate on your driving," Leah ordered as she pressed the phone to her ear and closed her eyes. When he answered after the third rang, Leah said calmly, "Mark? Hey babe, why are you on Annie's phone?" "Mark, Annie and I are on the way to the hospital." "What? Why? What's wrong?" "I'm on my way," Mark said in a flash, and she could hear jostling as he gathered his things. He had rented an office downtown earlier in the month and planned to set up his bass practice here. He'd been handling the business of moving his office and his things from his apartment in the city since Leah had told him she was pregnant. "How far out are you?" "Mark, calm down. Geez, we're about 15 minutes away, unless Annie breaks a speed record." "Of course, we may not make it," Leah joked. Annie glared at her and she glared right back. "What's wrong?" The sound of his car door slamming came through the phone and hurt Leah's ear. "You're not due for another 2 weeks. "Yes, but the doctor told us cross-species babies and really shifter babies come when they feel like it. If Chloe thinks she's—" An agonizing pain shot through her. She let out a yelp and dropped the phone in her lap. She crossed her arms over her stomach and leaned forward. Through the phone, Mark was yelling her name. Annie groped for it and put it to her ear. "Leah! Mark! I've got the phone!" Annie interrupted his yelling. "What happened? Why did she cry out?" Annie explained what had happened in the nursery. She assured him that there was no blood, but neither she nor Leah knew why she was hurting. "Is it labor pains? Is she having contractions?" Annie looked at Leah, who had relaxed though her face was stark white. "Leah, do you think you're having contractions?" "I don't know. Maybe. I've never had a baby before," Leah growled. "She doesn't know and I'm not asking her any more questions." "Okay. I'm at the hospital by the emergency room. I'll run in and have them prepare for her arrival." "Okay. We'll be there in 5. Annie ran 3 stop signs before reaching the hospital. At some point, a police officer had begun following them with his lights flashing, but Annie did not stop. She pulled right up to the door of the emergency room where Mark and a gaggle of medical personnel waited with a gurney. She exited the car to meet the police officer and explain, who ran to help them get Leah out once he realized what was going on. As they ran inside, Annie yelled her thanks over her shoulder. Once inside, one of the nurses halted and stopped Mark and Annie from following Leah to the back. Mark's raised voice echoed, "What the hell? She's having my baby." "Sir, I understand that, but we have to find out what's going on. If she's just in normal labor, we'll come get you to put on your scrubs. If she needs other medical attention, you can't be back there at this time." The nurse's expression changed from hard to understanding as she looked at Mark and Annie. "I understand you're scared. I'll come back as soon as I can with information." Mark and Annie watched her as she disappeared through the double doors. Mark heard a cry from Leah and nearly stormed the door, but Annie took his hand and held him beside her. He looked at her, completely lost. "What do we do now?" he asked. Annie's tilted her head in sympathy. He sounded like a sad little boy. "Now we wait." Mark paced almost the entire time they waited. He had debated whether or not to call his parents, but had decided against it. He didn't know anything to tell them at that moment, so calling them would only make them worry. When he had more information, he'd call. Mark wasn't a religious man, but he did believe a higher power had created the world and all in it. As a child, he had learned about Acre, the Egyptian god of the horizon personified as two lions with their backs to each other and the sun in the middle. He had never really worshipped this god, or any other specific god. He had always believed that meditation and becoming one with nature was the closest to God he'd ever get. But he couldn't shift and run through the woods to find peace. His peace, his life, was in an operating room where he couldn't get to her. After what seemed like an eternity, the nurse with the kind face returned. Mark marched up to her and nearly ran into her in his haste. "What's going on? She's been back there forever." Annie had moved to his side and clasped his hand in hers. "I'm sorry for the delay. Leah and the baby are fine. We were forced to do an emergency C-section." Mark breathed a brief sigh of relief, but a new terror entered his brain. Why? What was wrong? The baby had the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck. Mark and Annie gasped simultaneously in fear, but the nurse held up her hands. "She's fine now. Her heartbeat dropped and we had some trouble stabilizing her. Although her birth weight is healthy, she has a respiratory infection. This isn't uncommon in cross-species babies." "So she's okay?" Mark asked, stepping closer to the nurse to take one of her hands in his. The nurse smiled and patted his hand with her free one. "She'll be fine, but she will need to stay in the NICU for a few days, maybe only 2. But I can assure you the danger has passed." "The NICU? That's..." Mark looked at the nurse, then at Annie. The nurse nodded. "Scary, I know. But we have a doctor here who not only specializes in cross-species babies, he's a shifter himself. He's with her now and will come out to talk to you as soon as he can." "Can we see her?" Annie asked. "You can look through the window, but that's all. You won't be able to hold her for a couple of days. Only the mother can." The nurse informed them. "What about Leah?" Mark questioned. "I'll take you back to see Leah in a few minutes. She's getting her stitches." Annie grimaced, and the nurse chuckled. "Unpleasant but necessary, dear. The doctor can talk to all of you at the same time once I take you back." "Can we look through the window now?" Mark asked, antsy to see his daughter. The nurse smiled at him. "Of course. Follow me. Please speak in low voices if you speak." Mark and Annie nodded, then smiled at each other as they followed. The danger had passed, as the nurse had told them. They followed the nurse, who moved more quickly than they'd expected. After a myriad of twists and turns down hallways that all looked the same, they reached the NICU windows. Like a child outside a toy store, Mark pressed his face against the glass to catch a glimpse of his daughter. The nurse chuckled again. "There she is." She pointed to a baby in a clear bassinet under what looked like a heating lamp. "Why is she under that lamp? Isn't she hot?" Annie asked. She didn't know a lot about babies, but that didn't look normal. "Cross-species babies need sunlight, almost like a plant," the nurse explained. At Annie's skeptical look, the nurse winked. "You're a shifter. Shifter babies are a lot like human babies in what they need. But cross-species babies are more, for lack of a better word, delicate when they're first born." "You sound like you're the expert on cross-species," Mark remarked without taking his eyes off his daughter. "I train specifically to treat cross-species children," the nurse told him. "I take care of all babies, but I sure do love those cross-species babies." Mark looked at the nurse and grinned like the new father he was. "Can you bring her close to the glass? Just for a minute? I want to see her face." "Of course." She leaned in close. "You do know that cross-species babies are born with a human body but facial features of the creature he or she will shift into?" "Yes, I've done some research." Mark had returned his gaze to the baby. "Is she also covered with fur?" "Fur?" Annie asked, shocked. The nurse laughed softly as she put her finger to her lips. "Not so loud, please. Yes, she has fur." Annie stared through the window, her eyes narrowed. "Wow," she whispered. The nurse disappeared into the NICU. Mark and Annie watched as she gathered little Chloe into her arms and carried her to the window. She parted the blankets swaddled around her so they could see her face. Mark gasped when his daughter's face came into view. "She's beautiful," he breathed. He put his hand against the window as if to touch her through the glass. Annie put her arm around his waist as a tear slipped down her cheek and over her smiling lips. I'm so absolutely in love. Me too. Chloe's little fists began to flail about. She was angry because she wasn't under her lamp. She opened her eyes and looked around with an alertness neither Mark nor Annie expected. They both gasped and giggled when she met their eyes. Chloe, with her golden eyes and peach fuzz tan fur, watched them for a moment. Then she opened her perfect little mouth and let out a roar of anger. Mark and Annie saw the nurse laugh and talk to Chloe with a smile on her face. She turned away and put Chloe back under her lamp, where she quieted immediately and fell asleep. The nurse returned. Well, words escape me, Mark said. She roared. Annie exclaimed. Isn't she amazing? The nurse asked. That's a good word, Mark replied with a laugh. Come on, I'll take you to Leah. She'll be glad to see you. Has she seen Chloe? Briefly. When she's ready, one of us will wheel her down in a wheelchair to see her again. Okay, thanks. They returned the way they'd come, but only made 2 turns before they reached Leah's room. Her name was on a plaque outside the door. Quietly, Mark and Annie slipped inside the room after saying thank you and goodbye to the nurse. Leah opened her eyes slowly when she heard them. Did you see her? She asked Mark, who clasped her hand and lifted it to his lips. I did, Leah. She's miraculous. Leah chuckled, grimaced, and sighed. C-sections hurt. Annie giggled. What kind of drugs did they give her? Something good, Mark said with a smile. He brushed Leah's hair off her forehead. Are you okay, my love? Don't call me that weirdo, Leah murmured, a ghost of a smile on her face. I'm fine. How's Chloe? I only saw her for a minute. She's beautiful. A knock sounded on the door, and a young man poked his head in. Mark rose. Hi, can I help you? I'm Dr. Fargum, cross-species specialist, the young man said, affecting a bow. You're a doctor? Annie asked before she could stop herself. She put her hand to her mouth. I'm sorry, you just look so young. Good genes, Dr. Fargum said. He pointed at the jeans he was wearing and winked. I always look 10 years younger when I wear these. Mark stared at him for a second, then guffawed loudly before remembering he was supposed to be quiet. Dr. Fargum smiled at him. At last someone who gets my jokes. Mark laughed more quietly. I enjoy a good pun. Who doesn't? He turned to Leah. How are you feeling? I'm fine. How's my daughter? Leah asked. She is fine. As I'm sure you know, she has a respiratory infection, which isn't all that uncommon in cross-species babies. She'll stay in the NICU for 2 days, 3 at most, and then you'll be free to take her home. Leah breathed a sigh of relief as a tear rolled down her cheek. Thank God. I was so scared. I don't blame you, Dr. Fargum said. For the next couple of days, you need to rest, though. A cross-species baby, like shifter babies, grows at a faster rate than human babies for the first 2 months. A survival thing, I'm sure. I've done some research. She'll be able to crawl by the time she's 6 months, right? Human babies can't do that, Mark commented. That's right, the doctor replied. Watch out, Mom. You'll be a busy lady. Leah laughed quietly. I'm looking forward to it. When will they bring her back in here? Dr. Fargum shook his head. Chloe has to stay in the NICU tonight and tomorrow. But in the morning, we'll take you down there to see her. I can't see her until tomorrow? Leah whined. Mark took her hand. You need to sleep, babe. You can barely keep your eyes open. Leah mumbled something under her breath. What was that, babe? I said pick me up and take me down there now. Leah, Dr. Fargum said. I know you're eager to be with your daughter, but trust me, you need to rest. She's going to be quite a handful more quickly than you expect. Leah pouted but relented, although when she spoke she sounded like a spoiled child. Yeah, okay. Dr. Fargum chuckled and looked at Mark. You'll have your hands full tonight. Let me know if you need anything, Leah. I'll be with Chloe most of the night. Thank you, doctor, Mark said. Leah frowned at him. I really want to see her. Mark shook his head. I know, baby, but you have to rest. First thing, I'll find a wheelchair myself and push you down there. Will I get to hold her? Although she was still talking, she was fading fast. Her eyes were barely open. Mark smiled and played with her hair until her eyes closed. Yes, baby. I'm sure you'll be able to. Good, she mumbled as she slipped into sleep. Annie had been silent through the discussion. Now she stepped forward with a grin on her face. Poor Leah. She's going to be pissed she didn't get her way. Mark chuckled quietly. Yeah, you're probably right, but she'll get over it. Sure she will. As soon as she gets to hold that precious baby. Annie leaned over and kissed Leah's forehead. So on Chloe's little sign on her bassinet it said she was born just after midnight. I saw that. It's what, 2 now? Yeah, I think so. You know what that means? Mark looked at her, confused. No. What? Chloe and I have the same birthday. Annie grinned at him. That's fantastic. We'll have a big celebration every year, Mark said. Of course we will. Annie grabbed her bag off the chair near Leah's bed. I'm heading home. Are you staying here? I am. Okay. I'll be back in the morning, Annie said. Good night. Good night. Be careful. Mark returned his attention to Leah. He watched her sleep for half an hour before his eyes began to droop. He was determined. This woman would be his wife. He loved her beyond measure, and he knew she loved him too. He just had to convince her. His last thought was a picture of her in a wedding gown, holding their daughter and smiling at him.
Chapter 8. The next morning, Leah held her baby and cried. She had never seen anything more beautiful, more breathtaking, than the small creature in her arms. When the nurses would tell her she needed to use the time in the hospital to rest, she would resist until her eyes drooped. Mark had carried her back to her room once because she fell asleep in the wheelchair and nearly tumbled out. The flowers sent by countless friends and Mark's family scented the room, which pleased Leah. She'd always hated the smell of hospital rooms and hallways. On the 3rd day, Dr. Fargum walked into her room. Chloe had been released from the NICU the day before but not from the hospital. Because Leah refused to go home until her baby could leave, and luckily no one else needed the room, they had moved Chloe into her room. Mother and baby were so much happier together. Leah was holding Chloe when the doctor walked in. Good morning, ladies. Hello, Mark. How is everyone feeling? A little tired, but good overall, Mark answered with a yawn. Dr. Fargum smiled. And what about you, Leah? I'm great, although I am ready to go home. That's good. I'm releasing Miss Chloe this morning. You should be able to leave right after lunch, he told her with a smile. Leah whooped, scaring Chloe, who mewed loudly before settling back down. Sorry, baby girl, Leah whispered. She looked up at Mark. Will you take her? I want to get up for a minute. Mark took the baby and Dr. Fargum helped Leah stand. She'd been more mobile each day, although she couldn't hold Chloe while standing. Mark would be staying home with his little family for a week, working from home so he could help until Leah had healed and her stitches were removed. You're moving around well, Leah, Dr. Fargum complimented. Has your doctor been in yet? I saw her yesterday. She has already signed the release forms for me. We were just waiting for Chloe, Leah said with a smile as she moved gingerly around the room. Mark had sat down in the chair with Chloe and was making little cooing sounds at her. Chloe's little fist touched his face. She's so alert. I've never really been around babies. Is it normal for a baby to be so alert when only 4 days old? Cross-species babies, yes, Dr. Fargum told him. Mark giggled. It's so neat. Leah was staring at Mark as he played with their daughter. Her heart made a sound only she could hear. She fell in love with him at that moment. He looked up at her and saw her staring at him, and he felt it. A smile split his face, and his eye winked at her. Dr. Fargum looked from one to the other as the silence stretched and the couple didn't break eye contact. He dropped an appointment card on Leah's bed. He would need to see Chloe next week for a checkup. Without speaking, he left the room. Leah did not notice the doctor leaving. She was captured by the sight of Mark cuddling Chloe as he stared into her eyes. Slowly, she walked toward him, bent at the waist as much as she could, and kissed him softly on the lips. "You know now, don't you?" Mark asked. Leah nodded. "We belong together." "We do, Mark." "We absolutely do," Leah told him. "I love you, Leah." "Have since the day I met you," Mark told her, his eyes never leaving hers. "I love you too." She kissed him again. Chloe began to fuss. Leah brushed her cheek with her finger. "Sweet girl. She's not happy that she doesn't have our full attention." Mark laughed softly. "Spoiled already. Spoiled forever. Especially when my mom gets here," Mark commented, and they laughed. "I'm going to start packing up what's here." "I'm so ready to be home with her," Leah said. "You aren't going to pack." "Lay down, take Chloe, and I'll pack," Mark said as he rose. Leah started to protest, but the soreness and aches from the C-section stopped her. "You're right. Give me our daughter and get to work." "Yes, ma'am." In the car that afternoon, Leah clenched her teeth through each bump. Mark apologized constantly, but she told him to be quiet. He couldn't miss every bump. Relief swept through her when they finally pulled into the driveway of her home, even though the worst bumps were there. Leah was grateful for the pain medication the doctor had given her just before they'd left the hospital, but she wouldn't be using it after today's dose. She wanted to be alert and ready should Chloe need anything. When they pulled up next to the house, Annie and Jenny bounded out of the house together to meet them. Annie held Jenny's collar as Leah climbed out. The dog was dying to get to her mistress. "She has missed you so much, Leah," Annie told her. She'd let Jenny go on accident, but she only sniffed Leah all over and rubbed against her. "She seems to know she can't jump on you." Leah rubbed the dog's head, smiling. "I've missed you too, Jenny. I'm so glad to be home." "Want to meet your sister?" Mark laughed. "So they're sisters?" "Of course they are. I'm Jenny's mom, I'm Chloe's mom." "That makes them sisters," Leah insisted. Mark shrugged and reached for the baby carrier. He knelt a little so Jenny could sniff Chloe's head. Chloe looked at the dog and made a baby noise, which startled Jenny. She sniffed again, looked at Mark, and smiled her doggy smile. "I think she approves," Mark laughed as he straightened and walked towards the house with Jenny at his heels. He called back to Leah and Annie, "Don't worry about the stuff in the car. I'll come get it after everyone is comfortable." Leah followed at a much slower pace with Annie beside her. "Wait until you see the nursery," Annie gushed. "Did you finish it?" Leah asked, smiling. She had been worried about it. "I did." "I hope you like it," Annie said as she helped her up the steps. "I'm sure I will." Mark had gone straight to the nursery with Chloe so she could get used to her room. Leah walked in behind him and gasped. Annie had finished hanging the colorful letters of Chloe's name and had added 2 bean-bag chairs in eye-popping red and dark blue. The room was feminine without the use of pinks. Leah loved it. "I love it, Annie." "The bean-bags are such a nice touch," Leah gushed. "I had bean-bag chairs when I was a little girl. I slept on them, rolled around on them, they were my favorite." "I decided Chloe had to have a couple," Annie said with a shrug. "They're perfect," Mark said as he laid Chloe in her bed. She protested with a little mew, but settled quickly on the comfortable mattress and colorful quilt. Leah looked down at their daughter and took Mark's hand. They gazed at her together until Annie cleared her throat. "I think Jenny is moving in," Annie told them and pointed to the door. Jenny had gone into Leah's room and had dragged her dog bed from the corner of the room down the hall and into Chloe's room. She dragged it next to the bed, pushing Leah and Mark out of the way with her body so she could get her dog bed right up against the crib. Mark looked at Leah, and they began to laugh as Jenny sat down on her bed and watched the door as if daring someone to walk in that wasn't supposed to be in there. "I think Chloe is probably the safest baby on earth," Leah said, still chuckling. "I agree," Mark said. He knelt next to Jenny and rubbed her. "Such a good girl." Jenny grinned her doggy grin at him, then returned her attention to the door. Leah touched Chloe's cheek and smiled. "She's exhausted. Let's go into the kitchen and let her sleep." They left the room, Jenny on guard, and headed for the kitchen. Annie had made tea and had baked some cookies that morning. "You baked?" Leah asked, surprised. "I did. Your favorite." "Thank you, Annie," Leah said, tears in her eyes as she hugged her. "Why are you crying?" Annie asked. "Stupid hormones," Leah answered, wiping the tears off her face as she moved to sit carefully at the table. Annie brought the cookie jar to the table. "Milk or tea with your cookies?" "Milk." "Mark?" "The same, please." He reached across and took Leah's hand in his. He winked at her and whispered, "I hope the cookies are good." Leah giggled. "Me too." In a louder voice, she asked, "So, what's going on with the case? You haven't said a thing to me about it since I went to the hospital." "There hasn't been much to tell," Annie answered as she brought 3 glasses of milk to the table and sat down next to Leah. "We have a meeting with the judge, the dean, and the lawyer tomorrow." Mark paused. "That sounds like the beginning of a bad joke." The women smiled. Leah bit into a cookie. "These are good, Annie." "What's the meeting about?" "To see if we have to go to trial." "I really think the judge will tell them they will lose if they go to court, so they might as well give in and let shifters into the school." "What if they refuse?" "They can't if they lose in court. And honestly, if the judge tells them tomorrow that they have to let shifters in and they don't, the school can be fined and eventually shut down for breaking the law." "Wow," Leah mused as she reached for another cookie. "I've been hoping I'd get a call telling us the university has capitulated, but no such luck. So at 9 tomorrow morning, Annie and I will head to the courthouse and the judge's chambers to hash this all out." "Worth it, Annie?" Leah asked her. "Completely. They're breaking the law. They're denying deserving people an education because of their prejudice. It's just plain wrong." "I agree," Mark told her. "And these really are good," he said, gesturing at the cookies, of which he'd already eaten 3. "Thanks," Annie said. "I kind of feel bad because I'm going to Rainsford next semester after I threw a big fit about this place." "I wouldn't worry about it, Annie," Mark said. "You have to do what's right for you." "Yep. And right now what's right for me is to go to bed," Annie said. She rose and kissed Leah on the forehead. "I'm going to peek in at Chloe. Hopefully Jenny won't tear my leg off." As she left the room, Mark leaned over to Leah and kissed her solidly on the mouth. The kiss lasted longer than he had planned, and he felt himself getting hard. He pulled back with a little moan. "I better not get that started," he mumbled. "Give me another week and I'm going to jump your bones," she told him. "That day can't get here fast enough," he moaned. The meeting the next day went exactly as Mark had predicted, with only one difference. The judge did tell the dean and the lawyer that they would lose in court and would be forced to integrate the school. The dean had blustered about how ridiculous the law was, that schools had always been able to determine their own admission ideals. The judge disagreed, the dean argued, and the judge fined him for contempt. At that point, the dean had risen from his chair and exclaimed that he would be turning in his resignation by the end of the day. Meanwhile, Chloe was more alert than ever. She babbled constantly. When Jenny was in the room, Chloe wanted to see her and would fuss until she could. Jenny slept next to her crib every night and only let Mark, Leah, and Annie get near her. When Mark's parents had visited, Leah had been forced to lock Jenny in her bedroom because she wouldn't stop growling. Chloe had found this hilarious and giggled uncontrollably in the high-pitched baby giggle everyone adores. Jenny was her best friend, and when she laid on the floor, Jenny would lay next to her and they would cuddle. A week after they brought home their baby, Leah and Mark were chomping at the bit for some physical contact. Chloe, while developing much more quickly than they had been prepared for, still demanded much of their time. Neither of them minded, but they needed each other too. Leah asked Annie if she would mind sleeping with Chloe one night so she and Mark could have some alone time, and for the first time in nearly 3 weeks, the couple were able to enjoy each other. Leah surprised Mark. She lit candles and dimmed the lights. Dinner consisted of a picnic on a bedspread on the floor. She put on sexy lingerie covered by a diaphanous robe. When she heard him, her stomach clenched in excitement. She knew he'd stop in to see Chloe for a moment, then head to the bedroom to change clothes. The door opened, and Mark froze, looking around, eyes wide. Oh no, another love scene had to be taken out due to YouTube's policies. If you haven't already, join Romancely Audio Velvet to get love scenes for all stories. Link to join is in the description. Pause this and do that. It's okay. We'll wait. If you're already a member, the love scene references Baby for the Lion, Chapter 8, Love Scene 3. Signed up? Good, now back to the story. Leah considered. Well, I'm ready now. And I was thinking, Chloe could be our little flower girl. Annie would be my maid of honor, and we can get married on the dock. For a woman who just decided she wanted to get married, you have it all planned out, Mark teased. I realized I loved you the day after Chloe was born. Now I can't go back. You're stuck with me. Let's do this then. The end.
If you want more paranormal romances like this, please, my love, be sure to subscribe to the Romancely YouTube channel. I look forward to spending more time with you. Subscribe and let's make it happen.